Beneath layers of earth, hidden in crumbling temples and sunken ruins, lie messages carved by hands long turned to dust, messages no one alive can read. They speak in symbols that twist like smoke, in languages that resist all logic. Scripts etched into stone with precision, as if meant to last forever. Yet the meaning has vanished, swallowed by time. Who wrote them? What secrets did they hold? Were they prayers, warnings, or blueprints for something far beyond our grasp? Some are arranged in perfect spirals, as if following the pattern of a lost cosmos. Others seem to echo a language not born of any known world. We've scanned them, studied them, obsessed over them, but still, they remain silent. These are not just relics. They are puzzles left behind by civilizations that understood something we don't. They are keys without locks, songs without sound, codes no one can break. And tonight, we're going to explore them, one by one. So dim the lights, let the past speak in riddles. Sit back, relax, and let's dive into ancient languages and codes no one can decipher. Tucked away in the silent, climate-controlled vaults of Yale University's Bineka Rare Book and Manuscript Library lies a book like no other. Modestly sized, wrapped in a simple, aged calfskin cover, it rests under protective glass, ordinary at first glance. But once opened, its pages reveal a world no one can explain. The manuscript spans over 240 folios, filled with delicate illustrations and an ornate script that flows with rhythmic consistency, yet belongs to no known language. The parchment is real, painstakingly dated to the early 15th century, around the 1400s. Its ink is genuine, its pigments appropriate for the time. There is no doubt, this is not a modern forgery. It is a genuine artifact of the medieval world. But from the moment it was rediscovered in 1912 by rare book dealer Wilfred Voynich, this book has defied understanding. Every line of text is written in an elegant, looping script made up of strange characters, some familiar, others alien. Linguists, cryptographers, historians, and amateur sleuths have spent over a century attempting to decipher it. None have succeeded. No Rosetta Stone has emerged. No parallel texts, no crib or cipher key. The Voynich manuscript remains to this day unreadable. And yet, it feels like language. The characters repeat in patterns. Words appear to follow grammatical rules. There's structure, rhythm, flow, as if written by someone fluent in a tongue that no longer exists. Or perhaps never did. The mystery deepens with the illustrations. Some folios depict botanical drawings, plants that resemble nothing in the known world. Leaves twist in impossible shapes, roots tangle like veins. Flowers bloom in ways no botanist can classify. Elsewhere, elaborate circular diagrams fill the pages. Some seem astrological, others cosmological. One resembles a star map, though no constellations align with the known sky. Another hints at a calendar, complete with zodiac symbols, moons, and what appear to be spinning wheels of time. And then, there are the women. Dozens of folios are filled with small, naked female figures, drawn with a medieval hand, but surrounded by machinery, tubes, or baths of swirling liquid. Some are immersed in what look like alchemical vessels, connected by pipes that wind through the page like a forgotten circuit. Are they ritual images, medical, metaphysical? No one can say. What we do know is limited. Radiocarbon dating places the vellum in the early 15th century, and forensic tests confirm the ink is consistent with that era. The book was likely created in Central Europe, possibly northern Italy. There are faint signs of ownership, including a signature believed to belong to a 17th century alchemist. It passed through the hands of emperors, Jesuits, and collectors before arriving in Voynich's possession. But who wrote it? Some believe it to be the work of a lone genius, perhaps a medieval physician, herbalist, or mystic. Others suspect it was a hoax, an elaborate creation with no meaning at all, designed to impress, confuse, or conceal. But if it were meaningless, why does it obey so many linguistic rules? Why would someone go to such lengths to mimic grammar, syntax, repetition? That question led military codebreakers and intelligence agencies to examine the manuscript during World War II and the Cold War. Some of the best minds in cryptography, people who cracked Nazi ciphers, tried and failed to unlock it. If this is a code, it is one of the most complex ever devised. Then, there are the fringe theories. Some suggest the manuscript is written in glossolalia, an automatic script produced in a trance-like state, possibly a product of spiritual possession or madness. Others argue it could be a long-lost constructed language, like Tolkien's Elvish, created not for deception, but for personal expression. More speculative ideas drift into the surreal. Was it a communication from a secret society? A transmission from another world? A memory of a civilization that vanished long before history began? A few even point to extraterrestrial origins, noting the strange plants, the star-like diagrams, the flowing tubes that resemble unfamiliar technologies. But the most haunting possibility is this. What if the key to the Voynich manuscript is not in the pages themselves, but in the mind that wrote them? What if this is the work of someone whose thoughts, whose world, was so fundamentally different from ours that we cannot translate it, because we cannot imagine it? Today, artificial intelligence has been turned toward the manuscript. Algorithms analyze its structure, word patterns, and character frequencies, hunting for clues hidden even from the human eye. Some progress has been claimed, a resemblance to Hebrew, hints of a Proto-Romance language, but none are conclusive. For now, the book remains closed to us. We can scan it, photograph it, turn its pages with gloved hands. But we still cannot read it. Every letter remains a whisper from a forgotten voice, every illustration, a riddle inked in time. And so we return to that quiet vault at Yale, to the worn leather cover, to the pages that flutter like dry leaves. The Voynich manuscript waits there, just as it has for centuries, not demanding answers, only refusing them. What is it trying to say? And perhaps more unsettling, what are we failing to hear? The mystery remains. And now, we move to the next enigma. And while the Voynich manuscript rests quietly in a European library, resisting all efforts to decode its secrets, another enigma lies scattered across the Pacific, etched not in parchment, but in wood, and not found in the heart of a city, but on one of the most remote islands on Earth. Far out in the South Pacific Ocean, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, rises a lonely speck of volcanic rock. Easter Island, known to its native Rapa Nui people as Rapa Nui, is a place of haunting stillness. Wind sweeps over its grassy hills. The colossal stone Moai gaze endlessly inland, as if watching something long gone. But beneath these stone giants lies an even deeper mystery, one that has no face, only symbols. Scattered across a handful of wooden tablets, staffs, and ceremonial objects is a script that no one has ever read. A script unlike any other in Polynesia. Known today as Rongorongo, it is one of the few writing systems in human history to remain completely undeciphered, and perhaps the only one to have emerged in total isolation. The story of Rongorongo begins not with its creation, but with its rediscovery. In 1864, a Catholic missionary named Eugène Hérode arrived on the island. Among the many unusual sights he reported, one detail stood out. The locals, he wrote, possessed wooden tablets covered with hieroglyphs. Some used them in ceremonies, others were kept hidden. But no one, not even the elders, could explain what they said. It was as if the meaning had already slipped beyond living memory. Only 27 examples of this script are known to exist today. Many were lost, burned by missionaries, destroyed by weather, or taken away without record. What survives is precious, smooth driftwood, often palm or toramiro, each piece carved with careful, repeating glyphs. The characters are small, elegant, and strange, stylized figures of birds, fish, humans, eyes, paddles, and crescent shapes. Sometimes they seem to interact. Other times, they stand in rigid lines, like a procession of forgotten gods. Each line is read in a distinctive method, known as reverse boustrophodon, a zigzag pattern where the reader must flip the tablet upside down after each line. This pattern, rare in world scripts, hints at a complex system, one that suggests not only memorization, but ritual. Yet we cannot read a single sentence. Scholars have searched for structure. Some believe rongo-rongo is a form of proto-writing, symbols that convey meaning, but lack full grammatical language. Others argue it is a true script, a fully developed written system that captured speech, history, or even chants passed down for generations. There are tantalizing patterns, repetitions, glyph sequences that seem to cluster in ritualistic or genealogical forms. Some segments appear to match lunar calendars or astronomical cycles, suggesting a priestly function. A few tablets contain only a narrow range of glyphs, possibly denoting lists or hymns. But there are no Rosetta Stones, no bilingual inscriptions, no clear context for what these objects were meant to record. The Rapa Nui people themselves, devastated by colonial contact, slave raids, and disease, had already lost much of their oral tradition by the time researchers arrived. What was sacred had been scattered. The mystery of rongo-rongo deepens when we consider its origin. Did writing develop independently on this isolated island? If so, it would be one of only a few times in history that such a leap occurred without outside influence, joining the ranks of Sumer, China, and Mesoamerica. That possibility stirs awe. Could a culture so far removed from the known centers of literacy have birthed its own written language? But some remain skeptical. They suggest rongo-rongo may have emerged after European contact, perhaps inspired by Spanish script or Catholic texts. Yet the style, structure, and complexity of the glyphs resist that theory. There is no clear connection to Latin writing, no effort to imitate letters or known languages. The glyphs seem older, rooted in something uniquely Polynesian, yet wholly unlike any other Polynesian writing system. Then come the more speculative voices. Some see rongo-rongo not as language, but as sound, a mnemonic device, a visual rhythm to aid in oral recitation of sacred chants. Others believe the script was deliberately cryptic, reserved only for the initiated, shamans, priests, or royal scribes. There are whispers, even now, that a few among the Rapa Nui elders might still hold fragments of the knowledge, kept secret out of reverence or fear. And then there are those who wonder, was rongo-rongo ever meant to be read at all? Or was it a symbolic art, a ritual object imbued with power simply by its presence? Attempts to decode the script continue. Computers now analyze the sequence of glyphs, searching for linguistic patterns, statistical consistencies, anything that might crack the code. Comparative mythology, structural linguistics, and Polynesian oral histories are all drawn upon in the quest for understanding. Yet no firm progress has been made. Each new theory opens another door, and behind it, only more silence. There's something poetic in that. A script that endures not as a record of what was, but as a question that refuses to die. We see the glyphs carved into old wood, smoothed by time, weathered by salt air, touched by human hands long gone. Each line a message, each symbol a voice. But the language is quiet now. What prayers did these symbols once carry? What histories were etched into their curves? Were they stories of gods and ancestors, or warnings of things to come? We may never know. The Moai still watch, unmoving, as the wind passes over Rapa Nui. The birds still circle, the ocean still whispers against the cliffs. And somewhere, in that quiet, the lost words of Rongorongo remain, waiting for someone who can finally hear them. Next, we journey to the Indus Valley, where thousands of tiny seals whisper in another forgotten tongue. And from the wind-swept plains of Rapa Nui, where carved glyphs rest in silence beneath volcanic skies, we now turn to the dust and heat of South Asia, where the remnants of one of the world's oldest urban civilizations still lie buried beneath the earth. Amid ruins of brick and stone, scattered across Pakistan and northwest India, another script endures, etched into clay, carved into stone, stamped onto seals. It is ancient, it is structured, and like Rongorongo, it remains unread. In the shadow of the Himalayas and along the shifting banks of the Indus River, a great civilization once thrived. Flourishing over 4,000 years ago, the Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan culture, was vast, sophisticated, and remarkably advanced. It rivaled Mesopotamia and Egypt in both scale and complexity, yet left behind no monuments to kings, no pyramids, no ziggurats. Instead, it left behind symbols, tiny symbols, etched meticulously into steatite seals no larger than the palm of a hand. Square, smooth, and carved with incredible precision, these seals depict a blend of stylized animals, mythic creatures, and most notably, lines of short, linear script. The characters vary in form, some geometric, others curving or branching. They are repeated, arranged, and spaced with a clarity that suggests grammar, syntax, intention. Over 4,000 examples have been found, and yet, not a single one has been conclusively deciphered. This is the Indus script. The script appears most commonly on seals, used perhaps for trade, ownership, or ritual. Some are found on pottery, tablets, and amulets. They tend to be short, just a few symbols per line. Some scholars believe these were not meant to be lengthy texts, but identifiers, tags, or magical formulas. Still, their consistent structure hints at more than simple labels. Unlike other ancient writing systems, the Indus script lacks long inscriptions. There are no scrolls, no wall carvings, no stelae, no bilingual texts, no surviving literature, and no obvious links to modern languages. This absence, this quiet, makes the mystery all the more haunting. How does a civilization that built cities with grid-planned streets, advanced drainage systems, public baths, and long-distance trade networks leave behind a language we cannot read? Efforts to decode the script have spanned over a century. Linguists, archaeologists, computer scientists, and cryptanalysts have all tried. Some claim the script is logosyllabic, like Sumerian cuneiform. Others see it as entirely pictographic. A few believe it's a blend, symbols representing words, sounds, or concepts depending on context. But without longer texts, decipherment is nearly impossible. Many theories hinge on a central question. What language did the Indus people speak? Some suggest it was a Dravidian tongue, an ancestor of modern South Indian languages. This idea draws on possible linguistic links, but the evidence remains circumstantial. Others believe it was a lost branch of Indo-Aryan, or even a language isolate, unrelated to anything we know today. Some fringe theorists posit an extinct pre-Sumerian influence, or ties to an older, unknown global language. There is also debate over whether the script is even linguistic at all. A controversial theory suggests that the Indus symbols are not a true writing system, but rather a collection of religious or cultural symbols used to mark sacred objects or family lineage. Proponents argue that the brevity of the inscriptions and the lack of grammatical variability support this idea. But others counter that similar brevity exists in early stages of other writing systems, and the regularity, directionality, and repetition within the Indus script strongly suggest language. The seals themselves deepen the enigma. Many depict animals, real and fantastical. The humped bull, the unicorn, the elephant, the tiger. These creatures are often shown in profile, sometimes standing before what appears to be an altar or sacred object. What role did they play? Were they clan totems, divine representations, or parts of a mythic narrative now lost to time? Some seals show scenes that appear ceremonial, almost theatrical. A man in a yogic posture, a horned deity, a figure with multiple heads. Combined with the script, these images hint at a cosmology, a belief system, a cultural world we can glimpse but not enter. Occasionally, researchers spot patterns, recurring glyphs, phrases that seem to appear in specific contexts. But each discovery leads to more questions. One recent computational study suggested the symbols follow a Zipfian distribution, a mathematical pattern found in natural languages. But this, too, is not definitive. Modern technology has only deepened the mystery. Machine learning, statistical modeling, and image analysis have offered insights into structure and frequency. But without a known reference point, without a key, these tools can only go so far. And so, the Indus script remains unread, a voice that whispers from the dust, but never clearly speaks. What was recorded on these seals? Were they contracts, prayers, stories, names of merchants, invocations to gods, or something more abstract, philosophical, mathematical, even spiritual? And what happened to the people who carved them? Around 1900 BCE, the great cities of the Indus began to fade. Climate shifts, river changes, economic upheaval, perhaps all played a part. The civilization did not collapse in war or fire, but slowly dissolved, leaving behind no grand declarations, only silence. Whatever the Indus people believed, whatever they wrote, it was buried with them. Today, the seals rest in museum drawers and glass cases. Their symbols endure, but their meaning does not. We look upon them now with the same awe as those who first uncovered them. Not as curiosities, but as fragments of a civilization whose thoughts we may never fully recover. How many other languages have we lost to time? How many more voices have slipped between the cracks of history, waiting, perhaps, for someone who still knows how to listen? From the sun-baked cities of the Indus Valley, where ancient seals speak in a language no one can decipher, we now journey westward, across arid mountains, across the waters of the Aegean Sea, to the birthplace of myth and labyrinth. An island once home to a civilization so advanced, so elegant in its design, that even in ruins, it evokes wonder. Crete, the land of the Minoans. And at the heart of their mystery lies a script carved in clay, known to us only as Linear A. Beneath the white sun and rolling olive groves of Crete, the remnants of a vanished people sleep beneath stone and ash. The Minoans, Europe's first advanced civilization, flourished here more than 3,500 years ago. Their palaces were not fortresses, but open complexes, filled with light wells, colorful frescoes, and complex drainage systems. They left behind no records of war, only of ceremony, trade, and reverence for nature. But they did leave behind writing. Hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with a linear script, delicate, orderly, purposeful. Some are small, portable. Others are embedded in larger artifacts, sealed with stamps, impressed with signs. The characters appear carefully planned, made up of lines, strokes, and arcs. They form words, repeated structures, patterns. This is Linear A, one of the great undeciphered scripts of the ancient world. It was discovered in the early 20th century by archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, who uncovered it while excavating the Palace of Knossos. Alongside frescoes of dolphins and priestesses, bull leapers and labyrinthine passages, Evans unearthed hundreds of tablets. He quickly realized that the script he found came in two forms. One, he called Linear B. The other, older, more elusive, he named Linear A. For decades, both scripts were mysterious. But in 1952, Linear B was cracked. It turned out to be an early form of Greek used by the Mycenaeans, who inherited and eventually replaced Minoan rule. But Linear A, it did not yield. Despite visual similarities to Linear B, it records a language that is still unknown. Attempts to read it using the phonetic values of Linear B lead only to nonsense. It is, as scholars now believe, a completely separate language, one that does not resemble Greek, or Latin, or any known Indo-European tongue. The language behind Linear A has no clear descendants. It does not appear to have evolved into anything we recognize. It vanished, perhaps with the Minoans themselves. What remains are just over 1,400 inscriptions. Most are short inventories, lists, religious offerings perhaps. Some appear on ritual vessels, libation tables, ceremonial cups. Others are found in palace storerooms, etched in soft clay, then hardened by the fires that consumed these cities. The majority of texts come from three main sites: Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros. Each location suggests a network of administrative centers. But what did these records contain? What was so important that it had to be written in clay? Offerings to gods, accounts of trade, calendars, prayers. The Phaistos disc, a separate but related artifact, only deepens the mystery. Found at the Palace of Phaistos, the disc is a spiral of stamped symbols pressed into fired clay. It may be connected to Linear A, or it may represent a different system altogether. Scholars remain divided. Some believe that the Minoan language, preserved in Linear A, may have been part of a now lost linguistic family, a pre-Indo-European language group that once spanned the Mediterranean. There are faint whispers of such languages: the Lemnian script, found on an Aegean island; the Eteocratan language, recorded later in classical inscriptions. Could these be the last echoes of the Minoan tongue? Others turn to Crete's unique cultural identity. The Minoans were seafarers, trading with Egypt, the Levant, and mainland Greece. Their art is filled with fluid, organic forms, images of nature, not conquest. Might their language have carried a worldview radically different from that of neighboring powers? One that resisted translation not because it was complex, but because it was alien to the mental structures we've inherited. There are also those who suggest that Linear A was more than a utilitarian script, that it held ritual significance, that the words inscribed on clay were not just records of goods, but invocations, incantations, chants repeated in the echoing chambers of palaces during ceremonies long forgotten. The fact that so many inscriptions are found on objects associated with offerings hints at this possibility. In Minoan culture, writing may have been sacred, a medium not for communication between people, but between people and gods. And still, the script remains closed to us. Modern efforts continue. Computer models analyze stroke patterns, glyph frequencies, possible phonetic structures. Comparative linguists test connections to Anatolian languages, to Sumerian, to Basque. None have proven definitive. Without longer texts, without a bilingual inscription, without context, we are left with only symbols, fragments, whispers. What if the key to Linear A lies buried in the soil of an undiscovered site, or hidden in an artifact mislabeled and gathering dust in a forgotten storeroom? Or what if it's been in front of us all along, waiting for us to ask the right question? Today, the palaces of Crete stand in sun and shadow, their stones cracked by earthquakes, their walls faded by time. But the tablets endure. Clay, hardened by fire, stubbornly immortal. They bear the last traces of a language that once shaped ceremony, commerce, and belief. We can see the lines, trace the curves with our eyes, but we do not understand them. Not yet. What did the Minoans wish to preserve in these markings? What ideas, what dreams, what sacred truths did they choose to press into clay? And more importantly, will we ever understand what they tried to say? Now, we journey farther into the unknown, to a fire-hardened disk discovered in the same palace that hides another code, one not written in lines, but in spirals. From the elegant lines of linear A, carved into the clay tablets of Minoan palaces, we remain on the island of Crete, yet shift our focus to something stranger, something singular. While linear A appears across hundreds of artifacts, this next mystery exists in only one object, one disk, one message that has never been repeated and never been understood. In the heart of southern Crete, in the ruins of a palace that once echoed with footsteps of priests, traders, and rulers, archaeologists uncovered a small clay object, unlike anything else in the ancient world. The year was 1908. The man was Luigi Pernier, an Italian archaeologist excavating the Minoan site of Phaistos. What he found was no ordinary shard of pottery or fragment of fresco. It was round, about 15 centimeters in diameter, slightly concave like a shallow bowl, and covered on both sides with a perfect spiral of symbols pressed into the clay before it was fired. 80 years before the invention of the compact disc, the ancients had already left behind a spiral encoded with information. But unlike the discs of our modern age, this one cannot be read by any known machine or any human mind. This is the Phaistos disc. The disc is composed of 241 individual signs, grouped into 61 words or clusters, arranged in a clockwise spiral that begins at the outer edge and winds inward. Each sign was impressed using a set of stamps, making this the earliest known use of movable type in human history. The symbols were not carved, but pressed, implying a level of premeditation, standardization, and perhaps mass production. And yet, no other examples exist. Each symbol is distinct. Some depict human figures in motion, running, kneeling, wearing elaborate headdresses. Others show animals, plants, tools, and geometric shapes. There is an archer, a fish, a shield, a flower, a plumed helmet. But what do they mean? Scholars have debated this for over a century, and the mystery only deepens. The first question is whether the symbols represent sounds, syllables, entire words, or something else entirely. If they're phonetic, what language are they encoding? Is it the same unknown language captured by linear A? Or something older, more archaic, perhaps ceremonial? Then comes the issue of context. The Phaistos disc was discovered alone, with no other inscriptions like it. No bilingual texts, no accompanying tablets. Just a singular artifact, sealed in a basement room, as if hidden deliberately or stored for safekeeping. Its very uniqueness complicates any attempt to decipher it. In most cases, the decoding of ancient scripts depends on large numbers of texts and comparative material. But here, there is only one disc, one set of words, one chance. Mainstream scholars suggest the disc could be a hymn, a prayer, or a ritual chant, perhaps related to goddess worship or seasonal ceremonies. Others speculate it could be a traveler's message, a dedication, or even a legal contract. Without knowing the underlying language or cultural function, every interpretation is guesswork. More speculative theories have emerged over the decades. Some propose the disk encodes a calendar system. Others believe it may be a mathematical game or mnemonic device. A few argue that it could be an early cipher, a coded text created to conceal sacred knowledge. And then, as always, come the more unconventional voices. There are those who claim the disk is not Minoan at all, but the work of a much older or entirely different culture. Perhaps one that passed through Crete, leaving behind no other trace. Some even suggest a connection to lost civilizations, Atlantis, Lemuria, or an ancient seafaring society that predated recorded history. These ideas remain speculative and unproven, yet the disk's complete uniqueness makes them difficult to dismiss outright. Even more provocatively, some have noted that the spiral format and symbolic abstraction resemble certain types of encoded thought found in early mysticism, or even in altered states of consciousness. Could the disk be a record of vision, a symbolic map of inner experience? Despite countless efforts, ranging from the rigorously academic to the wildly imaginative, the Phaistos disk has never yielded its meaning. It is an object that resists interpretation, not because it is chaotic, but because it is too precise, too deliberate. It tells us that it means something, but refuses to say what. It is also remarkably well preserved. The clay was fired, either intentionally or by accident, which hardened it against time. The symbols remain sharp, the surface is clean, as though the disk was never truly used, only made, stored, and forgotten. What was it for? Was it an artifact of ritual? A prototype for a printing method that was never adopted? Was it a sacred object? A toy? A coded document passed between elite hands? The lack of any repetition in the archaeological record is its own riddle. Why create such a standardized system for one object only? Were there others, lost in fires, buried in still unexcavated chambers, or sitting misidentified in museum drawers? Today, the Phaistos disk is housed at the Heraklion Archaeological Museum, under glass. Visitors come from around the world to peer at its swirling glyphs, hoping to feel, if not to understand, the intelligence behind them. What message lies frozen in this fired clay? Is it a fragment of poetry, an invocation to gods we no longer name, or something entirely beyond our current comprehension? Perhaps the disk was never meant to be read in the ordinary sense. Perhaps it was meant to be experienced, a symbolic journey from outer form to inner truth, a spiral through language towards silence. We may never know. But still, it turns in the mind, this spiral of signs. Still, it draws us inward, toward a center we cannot reach. As the spiral of the Phaistos disk fades into silence, we drift eastward, far beyond the Aegean Sea, across the golden deserts and fertile plains of the ancient Near East. Here, in the cradle of civilization, long before the rise of Persia or the grandeur of Babylon, another writing system emerged, one of the oldest scripts ever created, and one that still refuses to be understood. Buried in the dust of southwestern Iran lies the enigma of Proto-Elamite. In the ruins of Susa, beneath layers of earth and broken time, archaeologists have unearthed tablets unlike any others. Baked clay rectangles, marked with sharp, deliberate impressions. Some are smooth and orderly. Others are dense and chaotic. Their surfaces are covered in symbols, some geometric, others abstract, all silent. These tablets date back over 5,000 years, to around 3100 BCE. Older than the pyramids, older than most Mesopotamian cities. They represent the earliest known writing system in what is now Iran. A script that flourished briefly, then vanished without explanation. We call it Proto-Elamite, a name that suggests both its origins and its uncertainty. The tablets were first discovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in excavations at Susa, once a powerful city in the ancient kingdom of Elam. Since then, thousands of fragments have been recovered, scattered across multiple sites. They are some of the earliest attempts at writing human thought, at fixing abstract ideas into physical form. And yet, we cannot read them. The symbols are unique. Over 1,000 distinct signs have been catalogued, far more than most known writing systems require. Many appear only once, leading some to believe the script was still evolving. Others argue that it may combine phonetic elements with ideograms, symbols representing entire ideas rather than sounds. But without a bilingual inscription, without a Rosetta Stone, the meaning remains elusive. What we can observe are patterns. Many tablets appear to be administrative. They include numerical notations, tallies, and lists. Some seem to document goods, grain, livestock, textiles, while others may refer to people, professions, or places. These clues suggest a culture with economic structure, record keeping, and perhaps even government oversight. The form is clear, the function is not. The Proto-Elamite script predates the Elamite cuneiform that would follow centuries later. But unlike the more stable systems of Sumer or Akkad, Proto-Elamite didn't evolve gradually. It appears suddenly, flourishes briefly, and then disappears. A flame that flickered once, then went out. Why? Some scholars believe the complexity of the system may have been its downfall. With so many unique symbols and no standardized form, communication may have become too unwieldy. Others suggest social upheaval, invasion, or cultural shifts might have contributed to its abandonment. But there are more puzzling theories too. Some researchers believe the Proto-Elamite script might not represent a spoken language at all. That it could be a system of symbolic notation, mathematical, economic, or ritual in nature, used not for everyday communication, but for specific, elite functions. A sacred ledger, a secret script. This idea gains traction when we consider how many tablets were found in elite or ceremonial contexts, rather than common dwellings. Was Proto-Elamite a language of the priesthood? A tool for encoding transactions too sensitive or sacred for the public? And then there are those who ask an even deeper question. What if the language behind Proto-Elamite is a language isolate? A tongue unrelated to any surviving linguistic family? If so, we may never hear its echoes in modern speech. It would be a voice completely lost in time. Despite decades of research, decipherment remains incomplete. Advances in digital imaging have helped, allowing scholars to examine eroded signs, reconstruct missing parts, and search for repeated patterns. But the code remains unbroken. A team at Oxford University has spent years cataloging the tablets, building digital tools to map the structure and flow of the script. They've uncovered correlations, frequencies, and contextual hints. But even with technology, the language itself refuses to open. One of the great difficulties is the absence of phonetic data. Without knowing how the symbols were pronounced, or even what kind of language they represent, we can only guess at meaning. It is like listening to a song with no sound, only the shape of its melody, etched in stone. Some have drawn connections between Proto-Elamite and the earlier tokens and bulle systems used in Mesopotamia. Methods of record-keeping involving clay envelopes and clay counters. Perhaps Proto-Elamite was part of this transition, from counting objects to writing names, from trade to thought. If so, it marks a pivotal moment in human history, the shift from memory to inscription, from oral tradition to written record. A moment when thought first took physical form. And yet, for all its historical significance, Proto-Elamite remains a ghost script. It speaks to us only in patterns and shadows. We do not know who created it. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they tried to preserve. Was this script an experiment? A failed step in the evolution of writing? Or was it a vibrant, living language, now silenced by time, erased by conquest or catastrophe. Perhaps somewhere, buried beneath the soil of Iran, lies a tablet we have not yet found. One longer, clearer. A text that would link Proto-Elamite to a known tongue, or unlock a new one entirely. Or perhaps the answers are already in our hands, hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to understand the logic that once guided those ancient scribes as they pressed symbols into damp clay under a setting sun. The silence continues. But in that silence, a voice still waits. From the sun-bleached tablets of ancient Elam to the scattered syllables of lost Pacific tongues, our journey through the world's undeciphered scripts now carries us across oceans and centuries, deep into the heart of ancient Mesoamerica. Here, amid tangled jungle and river-fed plains, the earliest echoes of civilization in the Americas began to rise. And with them, something else took form. Symbols carved in stone. Fragments of a language that no one can fully read. This is the mystery of Olmec writing. The Gulf Coast of modern-day Mexico is a land shaped by water and heat. Swamps, estuaries, and lush forests meet in a shifting dance of earth and river. It is here, around 1200 BCE, that the Olmec civilization emerged, the earliest known complex society in Mesoamerica. Known today as the mother culture of the region, the Olmecs laid the groundwork for those who would follow: the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, the Aztec. They built ceremonial centers, crafted massive stone heads from basalt, and developed religious iconography still echoed in later Mesoamerican art. But among their most enigmatic legacies are the traces of something more profound. Signs that they may have been the first in the Americas to develop writing. Scattered across their ancient cities, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, archaeologists have found symbols carved into stone stelae, inscribed on ceramic shards, etched onto jade artifacts. Some are geometric, others represent faces, animals, celestial forms. They appear in groups, repeating, arranged, intentional. But we do not understand them. One of the most striking discoveries is the Cascajal block, unearthed in 2006 near the village of Lomas de Tacamichapan. This rectangular slab of serpentine, weighing over 25 pounds, bears 62 distinct symbols arranged in rows. The glyphs are incised with care, images of insects, cornstalks, thrones, and other abstract forms. Scholars immediately recognize the possibility. Could this be the earliest known writing system in the New World? The block itself is dated to around 900 BCE. If authentic, and many believe it is, it pushes the origin of writing in Mesoamerica back by centuries. It predates Maya hieroglyphs. It predates Zapotec script. It suggests that the Olmecs were not only the progenitors of Mesoamerican iconography, but perhaps of literacy itself. And yet, no one has cracked the code. The symbols on the Cascajal block bear no obvious resemblance to later writing systems. They do not directly link to Maya glyphs or to known Mesoamerican syllabaries. There is no bilingual text to compare, no clear internal syntax, and no long inscriptions to analyze. The block stands alone, unique, uncorroborated, and fiercely debated. Some scholars argue that what we see is not true writing, but proto-writing, a system of signs used to accompany images or rituals, meant more to evoke than to explain. Others insist it meets the criteria of a true script, pointing to pattern repetition, directionality, and variation in sign use. Is it a list of offerings, a dedicatory inscription, a royal decree? We don't know. Beyond the Cascajal block, other artifacts offer tantalizing clues. An Olmec statuette found at Las Limas features glyph-like carvings along the body of a seated figure. A stone stela from San Lorenzo shows possible writing near the feet of a ruler. Jade celts, portable and polished, sometimes bear groups of symbols, isolated from each other, scattered like whispers. And then there are the colossal heads. 17 of them have been discovered, each carved from a single basalt boulder, each weighing several tons. Their features are individualized: wide faces, fleshy cheeks, downturned lips, and distinctive headgear. Scholars believe they represent rulers. But curiously, no inscriptions accompany them. No names, no titles, no dates. If the Olmecs had writing, why didn't they use it on their most monumental works? This question fuels debate. Some suggest that Olmec writing was restricted to certain media, perishable materials now lost to time: bark paper codices, painted murals, wooden tablets. Others theorize that writing was sacred, used only in ritual contexts, or hidden from public display. Fringe ideas have emerged as well: that the Olmec script was not native, but imported from a lost civilization, one that crossed oceans, or emerged from an older forgotten culture of the Americas. While there is no evidence to support these ideas, the absence of a clear lineage invites speculation. More conservative scholars suggest that Olmec writing may have influenced, but was not directly inherited by, later Mesoamerican scripts. Perhaps it was an experiment in literacy, brief, fragile, and ultimately extinguished, before it could evolve into a more robust system. Or perhaps it was preserved in ways we no longer recognize, its essence passed down in oral traditions, ceremonial forms, or cosmological symbols. Today, researchers continue to study the glyphs using digital tools. Pattern recognition algorithms, visual comparisons, and linguistic modeling have yielded some promising leads. But none are conclusive. The symbols remain mute. What were the Olmecs trying to say? Were they recording rituals, codifying power, marking the passage of time, or reaching for something more abstract, trying to capture the divine in visual form? The Olmec world was one of transformation. Jaguar men, feathered serpents, gods born of stone and smoke. Their art suggests fluid boundaries between human and animal, earth and sky, life and death. Perhaps their writing reflected that same fluidity, less a rigid alphabet, more a living language of vision and spirit. The jungle has swallowed much of their legacy. Temples collapsed, canals filled, cities lost beneath centuries of soil and root. And yet the symbols remain, carved in stone, etched in silence, waiting perhaps for the right question, or the right mind. What else might lie buried beneath the low hills and forest floors of Veracruz and Tabasco? What other tablets, blocks, or artifacts might still be hidden, holding the key to the oldest written voice of the Americas? As we leave behind the dense jungles and stone monuments of ancient Mesoamerica, we turn now to the quiet plains of Eastern Europe, where the soil holds its own secrets. Secrets older than the pyramids, older than the first cities of Sumer. Here, in a small Romanian village, archaeologists unearthed a handful of clay tablets, simple, weathered, unassuming. And yet, they may hold the earliest writing ever known, symbols carved by hands long forgotten. This is the mystery of the Tartaria tablets. In the heart of Transylvania, not far from the banks of the Mureș River, lies the village of Tartaria. Surrounded by rolling fields and quiet woods, the landscape feels timeless, almost untouched. But in 1961, beneath a thin layer of earth, something remarkable was found. Archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa was leading a dig at a Neolithic site when 3 small clay tablets were unearthed. They were fragile, crumbled at the edges, darkened by time. But what they bore shocked researchers. Imprinted on their surfaces were strange symbols, incised lines, geometric figures, repeating patterns. The discovery was soon named after the place they were found, the Tartaria tablets. 2 of the tablets are rectangular. 1 is round. All are small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. Their surfaces are etched with markings, crosses, chevrons, lines, and what appear to be stylized human and animal shapes. One tablet features a motif that resembles a tree or branching form. Another contains rows of signs arranged in neat lines, suggestive of a script. Their age, determined by radiocarbon dating of accompanying organic material, has been placed as far back as 5300 BCE. If accurate, that would make the Tartaria tablets more than 7,000 years old, predating Sumerian cuneiform by over a millennium. Older than Egyptian hieroglyphs. Older than writing, as we traditionally understand it. But are they writing? That is the question that has haunted researchers for decades. Mainstream archaeologists generally place the tablets within the Vinca culture, a Neolithic society that flourished in the Danube River basin from roughly 5,700 to 4,500 BCE. The Vinca people left behind figurines, ceramics, and settlement ruins, many of which bear similar marks and signs. Some scholars interpret these symbols as decorative or symbolic, part of a proto-writing system used to convey ritual meaning or ownership. But the Tartaria tablets are different. Unlike most Vinca artifacts, which are marked casually or sparingly, the tablets feature dense arrangements of symbols, organized, repeated, aligned. To some, this suggests intention, structure, language. And if this is writing, it would rewrite the history of literacy. For years, the dominant narrative has placed the birth of writing in Mesopotamia, with the Sumerians developing cuneiform around 3200 BCE. But the Tartaria tablets and the broader body of Vinca symbols challenge this timeline. Could writing have emerged independently in prehistoric Europe? And if so, what happened to it? Critics point out that the tablets may not have been written by the people of Tartaria at all. Some speculate that they were imported, possibly from a more advanced culture farther east or south. A few even question the dating, suggesting that the tablets may have been contaminated or misattributed. The tablets themselves were reportedly fired after excavation, meaning their original condition and context were partially altered. That alone adds a layer of uncertainty that clouds every attempt to analyze them. Still, the symbols remain. Over 700 distinct signs have been catalogued from Vinca sites across the region. Many appear on ceramics, tools, and figurines. Some recur in patterns. Some bear an uncanny resemblance to later scripts, cross-like signs, three symbols, fish-like forms. A few even parallel early Sumerian pictographs or linear A glyphs. Are these coincidences of visual form? Or is there a deeper connection? A small number of researchers have pursued the idea that the Tartaria tablets represent a lost European script, an original form of literacy that flourished briefly, then vanished. Perhaps it was a ceremonial system, restricted to a priestly or shamanic class. Perhaps it was used to encode myths, lineage, or ritual knowledge. And when the culture collapsed or faded, so too did its language. More fringe theories go further. Some suggest the tablets are remnants of a forgotten civilization, predating all known societies, existing before the flood myths that ripple through world folklore. The idea of a prehistoric, old Europe, rich in symbolism, matriarchal spirituality, and early complexity, has captivated imaginations since the mid-20th century. But while such ideas stir curiosity, they remain speculative. The truth, as it stands, is quiet and unresolved. The Tartaria tablets are real. Their symbols are deliberate. But what they say, or if they say anything at all, is still a matter of debate. Are we looking at the roots of written expression? A first step in humanity's attempt to capture thought in form? Or are these markings something else entirely? Ritual signs, sacred emblems, records of belief now beyond our reach. What was the purpose of these tablets? Were they offerings? Were they tokens of authority? Or were they merely symbols of status, never meant to be read, but only seen? Today, they rest in a museum in Romania, fragile pieces of clay that may or may not contain the oldest written words ever formed by human hands. What other messages lie buried in the soil of southeastern Europe? What knowledge did the Vinca culture leave behind, waiting for someone, someday, to understand the language of its symbols? From the ancient plains of Europe, where the Tartaria tablets hint at forgotten beginnings, we now travel to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Here, waves have lapped against sun-bleached stone for millennia. Here, trade once flowed like blood between the great civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. And nestled in this cradle of commerce lies the city of Byblos, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, and home to a writing system that no one has ever truly deciphered. This is the mystery of the Byblos syllabary. The city of Byblos, in modern-day Lebanon, rises from the rocky coastline like a whisper from the Bronze Age. Its harbor, though quiet now, once teemed with ships, laden with cedar wood, papyrus, copper, incense. Ancient Egyptians called it Kepni. The Greeks named it Byblos, after the papyrus trade that passed through its docks. It was a city of exchange, where ideas, languages, and cultures converged. But amid the familiar relics of Phoenician, Egyptian, and early Canaanite inscriptions, archaeologists found something strange. Fragments of stone and metal, inscribed with an unfamiliar script. It bore resemblance to none of the established systems of the time. Its signs were neither hieroglyphic nor cuneiform, not alphabetic nor purely pictographic. It was something else entirely. The writing was first noticed in the 1920s, and by the 1940s, French archaeologist Maurice Dunand had catalogued a collection of texts found in Byblos, including several inscriptions written in this unknown system. He called it a syllabary, a writing system based on syllables rather than single sounds or full words. The Byblos syllabary. Around 90 distinct characters have been identified. Some look geometric, triangles, chevrons, circles. Others are more elaborate, with curved forms and branching strokes. The inscriptions themselves are brief, often appearing on bronze plaques, tablets, and ceremonial artifacts. Their age is uncertain, but estimates place them between 1800 and 1400 BCE, contemporary with the great empires of the late Bronze Age. If these texts could be read, they might offer a rare glimpse into the early development of writing in the Levant. But they cannot. To this day, the Byblos syllabary remains a closed book. Its structure is unlike the Phoenician alphabet that would later emerge from this same region, an alphabet that would eventually give rise to Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew. The Byblos script comes from an earlier time, and perhaps an earlier tradition. Some researchers have proposed that the script is derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, an offshoot of the cursive forms used in administration. Others believe it may have been influenced by cuneiform signs from Mesopotamia, adapted to suit a local Semitic language. But these are only theories. No bilingual inscription has ever been found. No document exists that offers a clue to pronunciation, grammar, or vocabulary. Some of the texts are accompanied by images of animals, tools, ceremonial objects. But none of these provide a clear context for the writing. Are the inscriptions prayers, inventories, legal declarations, names of kings or gods? We simply don't know. Several attempts have been made to decipher the script. A few scholars have proposed partial phonetic values based on comparisons to later Semitic languages, but consensus remains elusive. Each theory builds on educated guesses, correlations that lead only to further ambiguity. Could this be a transitional script, one of those rare fleeting systems that bridge the gap between complex pictographs and simplified alphabets? If so, It could represent a missing link in the story of writing. A chapter between the divine inscriptions of Egypt and the practical alphabets of the Phoenicians. Or was it an isolated invention, unique to the scribes of Byblos, used for a purpose now lost to time? Some have suggested that the Byblos syllabary was ceremonial, used only in temples, reserved for priestly classes, or for ritual inscriptions not intended for public use. Others argue it may have been an experimental script, an effort by local elites to develop their own system of record-keeping or religious expression, distinct from their more powerful neighbors. And, as always, more speculative ideas have emerged. A few fringe theorists see the script as evidence of contact with even older, forgotten civilizations. They point to visual similarities between the Byblos characters and those of the Indus Valley, or the Vinca symbols of Old Europe. These comparisons are highly debated and often dismissed by mainstream scholars, but they reflect a broader yearning to connect these unsolved puzzles into one coherent map of lost knowledge. Still, the tablets remain quiet. They sit today in museums and archives, weathered bronze plates and stone fragments, each one marked with lines that once carried meaning that has now become silence. Was the Byblos syllabary the voice of an unknown kingdom? A sacred script meant only for the initiated? Or simply an experiment in literacy, abandoned in favor of more practical systems? And what might we uncover if we could finally read these texts? Might they tell us stories of ancient rulers and forgotten rites? Might they name gods we no longer remember? Or might they reveal a culture whose thoughts and language once flourished on the edge of the known world, before vanishing into the folds of history? The questions remain, the signs endure, but the voice behind them is still missing. From the bronze tablets of ancient Byblos, etched with symbols whose meaning has drifted beyond memory, we now step into a different kind of mystery. One not carved in stone or pressed into clay, but drawn in exquisite color. A modern artifact that evokes the same silence, the same unanswered questions. A book written in an invented script, filled with surreal imagery and unfathomable systems. It is beautiful, it is haunting, and it has never been understood. This is the mystery of the Codex Seraphinianus. It looks like a field guide, or a textbook, or perhaps a scientific manual from a civilization no one has ever seen. Roughly 360 pages long, bound in red, filled with intricate illustrations and an alien script, the Codex Seraphinianus was first published in 1981. Its creator, Luigi Serafini, an Italian architect and designer. He spent nearly 2 years composing it entirely by hand. Open its pages, and you enter a world that is not quite ours. A world both whimsical and unsettling. Here are plants that bloom into stairs, creatures that morph mid-motion, skeletons that wear robes, fish that become birds, tools with no clear function, cities with looping staircases and recursive logic. A couple makes love and transforms into an alligator. A strange alphabet flows across every page, looping, elegant, consistent, and completely undeciphered. Serafini has explained that the text is not meant to be understood. He has said that it was written in a form of a Semitic writing, text that looks like language, but has no semantic content. According to him, it captures the experience of a child looking at books before learning how to read. The illusion of language, the presence of meaning without access to it. And yet, people have tried to decode it. For decades, cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, and puzzle enthusiasts have analyzed the script. They've cataloged symbols, tracked letter frequencies, mapped character sequences. Some claim to see patterns, a grammar, perhaps even phonetics. Others insist it's all a visual trick, a carefully constructed imitation of language. But the question lingers. If the codex truly contains no message, why does it feel like it does? Why the repetition? Why the structure? Why the careful separation into chapters, topics, diagrams? Why mimic taxonomy, engineering, history, and cuisine if there is nothing beneath the surface? Some researchers believe the script may function like a code, encrypting Italian or another known language beneath a symbolic veil. Others suspect it may be partly readable, that certain pages contain clues hidden in plain sight. Even the page numbers follow an internal logic, written in a unique base 21 numeral system that has been partially decoded. And then, of course, there are the more speculative theories that the codex is a transmission, a message not from the past, but from the future, or from another dimension. That Serafini tapped into something larger than himself, channeling knowledge he did not consciously understand. Some describe it as a book of dreams, a subconscious architecture, a mirror held up to human thought, where logic and nonsense dissolve into something else entirely. There are those who compare it to the Voynich manuscript, another mysterious codex we'll explore soon, an older, more fragile cousin in the lineage of unreadable books. Both share the quality of an invented language. Both contain botanical drawings of imaginary plants. Both seduce the reader into a puzzle without a solution. But the Codex Seraphinianus is different in one crucial way. Its creator is still alive, and he has insisted, again and again, that there is no hidden meaning, no secret code, just the illusion of sense. Still, some are not convinced. Could Serafini be preserving a secret, protecting the purity of interpretation? Or did he perhaps tap into something deeper than language? Some primal cognitive experience that exists before words form, before categories shape our understanding of the world. In a way, the Codex feels like it should make sense. It mimics the world we know. It gestures towards science, biology, architecture, society. It plays by rules, just not ours. Its language flows left to right. It has punctuation, consistent character sets, clear divisions between words. It isn't random. It's structured. And that is what keeps readers returning. Not to solve it, but to sit with it, to dwell in the mystery, to feel what it means to be surrounded by signs you cannot read, and to be moved by them anyway. What does it mean when a book is written to resist comprehension? What do we learn about ourselves when faced with language that denies us meaning? Does the Codex reflect a dream world, or simply our own world seen through unfamiliar eyes? Some call it art. Others call it a hoax. Some treat it as a mystical object. Others a philosophical experiment. But perhaps it is none of these things, and all of them. A book that means nothing. A book that means everything. The Codex Seraphinianus is not ancient. It is not lost. And yet it belongs somehow in this lineage of unreadable texts, alongside ancient seals, carved tablets, and forgotten syllabaries. It asks the same question. What is language, if no one can read it? And perhaps more mysteriously, what is it trying to tell us, even now? From the surreal illustrations and indecipherable script of the Codex Seraphinianus, we return to history, to a time when empires rose and fell across the steppes and mountains of East Asia. Among them, one dynasty carved its legacy into stone and silk, ruling over vast territories, blending cultures, and leaving behind a script both monumental and unread. In the shadows of ancient tombs and ruined capitals, the letters of this empire remain etched in silence. This is the mystery of the Khitan large script. In the northern reaches of China and southern Mongolia, where grasslands stretch across the horizon and wines stir the dust of long-forgotten borders, once stood the empire of the Khitan. Little known in the West, the Khitan people were formidable. a semi-nomadic people who, in the 10th century, established a powerful dynasty known as the Liao. They ruled over a vast and multi-ethnic realm, one that rivaled the Song dynasty, and shaped the politics of East Asia for over 200 years. But the Khitan did something unusual for their time. They didn't just borrow Chinese characters, like many neighboring cultures. They created their own scripts, not one, but two. The Khitan large script, our focus now, and the Khitan small script, equally mysterious and perhaps even more obscure. These scripts, devised by imperial command, were used to record laws, edicts, dates, rituals, and courtly affairs. They adorned steles, official documents, and imperial tombs. And yet, despite being in use for centuries, we cannot fully read them. The Khitan large script was created around the year 920 CE by order of Abaoji, the founder of the Liao dynasty. It was an effort to solidify a unique cultural identity, one that stood apart from the dominant Chinese influence of the time. The script was inspired by Chinese writing, and many of its characters resemble Chinese forms. But the resemblance ends there. The Khitan large script contains over 700 individual symbols. Some are logographic, standing for whole words or concepts. Others are syllabic, representing sounds. Many are entirely unique. The script lacks consistent punctuation, and characters can vary widely in meaning, depending on their placement. Its usage is sparse. The surviving corpus includes inscriptions on stone monuments, eulogies for deceased nobles, and scattered official records. Among the most significant discoveries are the funerary epitaphs found in Liao tombs, large stone slabs inscribed with dense blocks of Khitan text, arranged in solemn vertical columns. These epitaphs are the Rosetta Stones that never materialized. We have names, dates, and some contextual hints thanks to accompanying Chinese inscriptions. This has allowed scholars to identify a few Khitan characters, especially those used to record imperial titles, locations, and calendrical information. But that's where the trail begins to fade. No complete bilingual text has ever been found. No native Khitan dictionary survives. And the Khitan language itself, spoken by a people now long gone, has left behind no direct descendants. Researchers have attempted to reconstruct the language through comparative linguistics, drawing parallels with other para-Mongolic languages, and with the Yurchin and Tungut scripts that followed. Some progress has been made. Scholars have decoded small parts of the funerary inscriptions. A few dozen characters are now tentatively understood. But the majority of the script remains silent. Why did such a carefully developed writing system disappear so completely? When the Liao dynasty was conquered by the rising Jin dynasty in the early 12th century, many Khitan elites fled west, establishing the short-lived Western Liao, or Kara Khitan Empire, in Central Asia. There, their language and script may have continued for a time, but evidence is scarce. Eventually, the Khitan people were absorbed. Their traditions faded, and their script was forgotten. Some historians believe that the deliberate uniqueness of the Khitan large script was also its weakness. By deviating from the dominant Chinese systems and lacking widespread adoption outside the court and aristocracy, it became isolated, tied to a culture that vanished. And yet, the script endures. Monuments bearing Khitan inscriptions have been found across northern China and Inner Mongolia. Every few years, new fragments are unearthed, sometimes accidentally during construction, sometimes in deliberate archaeological digs. Each inscription adds another piece to the puzzle. But it remains a puzzle without a clear image. Why did the Khitan need two scripts? What were the functional differences between the large and small scripts? Were they used by different classes? For different domains, religion, governance, literature? Was the script meant to preserve knowledge or conceal it? Some speculate that the Khitan elite guarded their language closely, reserving literacy for ritual or statecraft. If so, the script may have been an instrument of power as much as communication. Others suggest that the Khitan large script might encode more than speech, that it could include elements of ritual symbolism or ancestral reverence, particularly in the funerary texts, a blend of record and invocation, of memory and mystery. The Khitan script has even drawn the attention of cryptologists and artificial intelligence researchers who hope to use pattern recognition to break through the veil. Progress is slow, but not hopeless. Each new discovery holds potential. A longer inscription, a clearer context, a name we can verify, a repeated structure, the whisper of a voice returning through stone. But for now, the Khitan large script remains unread, a monument to a lost empire, its letters carved in strength, but now worn by time. What stories lie in those vertical columns? What laws? What poems? What prayers? Who were the people who wrote them? What did they believe? And why does their voice still elude us? The answers may still rest beneath the soil of northern China, under the foundations of old temples, or behind the sealed stones of forgotten tombs, waiting for someone to read what was never meant to be forgotten. The winds that once whispered across the tombs of the Liao emperors now fall silent, leaving behind the cryptic remains of a forgotten empire. We have explored the monumental Khitan large script, its characters carved deep into stone, its meanings only faintly glimpsed. But just beside it, often overshadowed, lies another enigma. A second system, smaller in name, but even more mysterious in form and function. If the Khitan large script was a voice of authority, the Khitan small script may have been the language of something more personal, more fluid, and now even more lost. This is the mystery of the Khitan small script. Beneath the scattered ruins of Liao dynasty cities, hidden in ancient tombs, and buried among artifacts now locked behind museum glass, are fragments of a script unlike any other. Slender, upright characters, some angular, some flowing, all densely packed into vertical lines, etched into stone, metal, and possibly once written on silk or paper. This was the Khitan small script, a complex, beautiful, and deeply elusive writing system, used by the Khitan people alongside their large script during the rule of the Liao dynasty, from the 10th to the early 12th centuries CE. Where the large script was modeled loosely on Chinese logographs, the small script was something far more innovative and far less understood. Developed around the same time, likely in the early 920s, it may have been the creation of a scholar named Yelu Diela, a Khitan official charged with designing a script better suited to the spoken Khitan language. But if this system was meant to preserve the voice of a people, that voice has since vanished almost entirely. To the modern eye, the Khitan small script resembles nothing familiar. It is neither alphabetic nor purely syllabic. Some of its characters are compact and repetitive, others wide and complex, hinting at different phonetic or semantic functions. Scholars estimate the script contained anywhere from 300 to 500 characters, but no definitive list exists. No key, no primer, only the script itself. The documents that survive are few. Short inscriptions carved into tomb epitaphs, some steely fragments, occasional mentions in Chinese chronicles. Nearly all of them lack direct translation. Without a bilingual Rosetta Stone, or even a clear idea of what the Khitan language sounded like, each inscription becomes an unsolvable cipher. And unlike the Khitan large script, which has yielded small victories in decipherment, the small script remains almost completely undecoded. It defies classification. Why did the Khitan need two scripts? Theories vary. Some suggest the small script was used for everyday purposes, private correspondence, record keeping, literary works, while the large script was reserved for monumental use, rituals, and official declarations. Others propose the opposite. Still others argue that the two systems were used concurrently, but reflected distinct dialects, classes, or regions within the empire. But the truth remains buried, both literally and linguistically. The Liao dynasty collapsed in the early 12th century, conquered by the rising Jurchen-led Jin dynasty. While some Khitan elites fled west and established the Kara Khitan Khanate, they did not carry the scripts with them in any form we can trace. The writing vanished. The spoken language followed. Within generations, the Khitan people were linguistically absorbed, their scripts no longer taught, no longer understood, even by their descendants. And yet, the small script remains, etched in stone, inked in memory. Each inscription is a closed door. We can see the craftsmanship. We can trace the flow of each line. We can even match patterns and recurring symbols. But the meaning, the voice behind the script, stays silent. Is this merely a record-keeping tool lost to time? Or is it something more? A sophisticated, perhaps even esoteric system, used by an elite caste of scribes? Was it inspired by the desire to create a wholly independent cultural identity? Or was it designed to encode knowledge that couldn't easily be conveyed through the borrowed scripts of neighboring powers? The structure of the small script adds to its mystique. Scholars believe it included determinatives, symbols that indicated the category of the word that followed, much like Egyptian hieroglyphs. Others suspect the presence of grammatical markers, suggesting a sophisticated system of conjugation and syntax. And yet, we can't confirm any of this. We have hypotheses, but no translations. Modern technology has stepped in. Natural language processing, comparative linguistics, and artificial intelligence are all being deployed to study these scripts. But unlike other ancient languages where we have sound correspondences, word banks, or oral traditions, the Khitan small script offers no such footholds. It is not just unread, it is ungrounded. And still, the inscriptions persist. On the stone slab of a forgotten prince, on a crumbling pillar outside an abandoned temple, symbols etched by hands that believed what they were writing would be remembered, preserved, read. But time, as always, had other plans. The enigma of the Khitan small script is more than a linguistic puzzle. It is a cultural silence, a vanished voice, a written language that outlived its speakers, but not its secrecy. How many more fragments might still lie buried beneath the grasses of Inner Mongolia or the sands of Manchuria? How many inscriptions went unnoticed, mistaken for decorative markings, or misunderstood entirely? And if we were to decipher it, if we could one day read the names, dates, and prayers of this lost script, what would we learn? What truths would the Khitan tell us across the gap of 10 centuries? Perhaps the script is waiting not just for understanding, but for rediscovery. Waiting, as so many lost languages do, to be heard once more. From the intricate vertical strokes of the Khitan small script, etched in stone, unread, and slowly fading from memory, we now return to the ancient Mediterranean, to an island bathed in sunlight and steeped in myth. Crete, home to labyrinths, bull leapers, and a civilization whose language spoke in pictures. Before Linear A, before the Phaistos disk, there was something even more enigmatic. Symbols carved and painted, evoking gods, animals, tools, and questions. These are the forgotten signs of the Cretan hieroglyphs. Beneath the azure skies of Crete, where olive trees whisper in the wind and ruins rise from the earth like worn bones, lie the remnants of the first palatial centers of the Minoan world. It was here, in places like Knossos, Malea, and Petros, that archaeologists uncovered not just artifacts, but something stranger, something older. Small, palm-sized clay seals, fragments of tablets, impressions in soft earth hardened by fire. And on them, inscribed in fine, deliberate strokes, are symbols that look part art, part code. A bird mid-flight, a double-headed axe, a fish, a hand. Abstract marks like cones or spirals. They seem familiar, recognizable. But together, they speak in a voice no one understands. These are the Cretan hieroglyphs, a writing system that emerged around 2000 BCE, possibly earlier, and predates both Linear A and Linear B. Though it shares the island's cultural DNA with those later scripts, it is distinct. Its characters are pictographic, closer in form to Egyptian hieroglyphs than to alphabetic or syllabic writing. Yet the resemblance is only superficial. The two systems likely developed independently. The Cretan hieroglyphs are mostly known from a small number of sources, about 150 artifacts in total. The majority of these come from Central and Eastern Crete. They include seal impressions, ceremonial objects, and a few inscriptions on stone and metal. But the texts are short, rarely more than a few characters. There is no long-form writing, no surviving sentences, just isolated bursts of expression, frozen in time. The most famous example is the Arkalakori axe, a bronze votive weapon found in a cave, its blade engraved with 15 symbols. It's been proposed that these marks are in Cretan hieroglyphs, though the interpretation remains uncertain. Was it an offering to a deity? A list of names? A spell? Then there are the seals, tiny clay medallions used perhaps for marking ownership or securing goods. They bear inscriptions in Cretan hieroglyphs, often paired with symbols of power: bulls, horns, the sun. Their meaning remains opaque. Are they personal identifiers, religious tokens, elements of a larger system of administration or ritual? No one knows. And yet, despite their simplicity, despite their brevity, these glyphs suggest a structured, possibly complex system. Some signs appear repeatedly, sometimes in combination. Others seem to act as determinatives, providing context for the surrounding characters. There's a rhythm to them, a logic that hints at underlying grammar. But without longer texts or a bilingual key, interpretation is impossible. The meanings of the glyphs, individually and collectively, remain speculative. Were they used to write the same language that later appears in Linear A? Or were they an earlier language entirely, now lost to history? Is Cretan hieroglyphic writing ancestral to Linear A? Or did the two systems evolve side by side, used for different domains, different purposes? Some scholars believe the Cretan hieroglyphs were ceremonial, perhaps used only in sacred or elite contexts. Others suggest they were part of an administrative system, marking goods, recording trades, or identifying officials. Still others think they may have held magical significance, symbols not of language, but of power. And beyond the mainstream, more speculative voices have emerged. Some have proposed that the pictographic nature of the script indicates a symbolic rather than phonetic system. That the signs might not have represented sounds or syllables, but ideas, a kind of proto-language, halfway between image and word. Others, more fringe, suggest links between Cretan hieroglyphs and other ancient scripts, Anatolian hieroglyphs, Egyptian signs, even the symbols of the Indus Valley. These comparisons remain controversial, often based on visual similarities rather than linguistic evidence. Still, the question remains: what did these early Minoans seek to preserve with their symbols? What was so important that it needed to be inscribed, not spoken? A transaction, a name, a myth. And why did this script disappear? By 1700 BCE, Cretan hieroglyphs begin to vanish from the archaeological record. Around this time, we see the rise of Linear A, more abstract, more standardized, more efficient. Perhaps it was a technological evolution. Or perhaps it marked a cultural shift, a new language, a new power, a new way of thinking. Yet, even in their disappearance, the hieroglyphs leave a trace. Some linear A symbols may have been inherited or adapted from them. The idea of writing, of recording, of fixing language in place survived. But the words themselves did not. What we are left with is a script that seems to gesture toward meaning, but never delivers it. A hand etched into clay, a fish beside a star, a bird caught mid-flight. Each a whisper from a people we cannot hear. What stories were lost in those seals? What prayers went unspoken when the script faded from use? What truths might still be hidden in a cave wall or a forgotten tablet, waiting to bring light to a language drowned by centuries? The Cretan hieroglyphs remain, as they always have been, silent signs from the dawn of European literacy. A language without sound, a writing without voice, a mystery etched in stone. As we leave behind the pictorial grace of Cretan hieroglyphs, symbols etched in ritual, purpose, and silence, we now journey to the mist-veiled river valleys of southeastern Europe. Here, long before the classical world emerged, a different kind of culture thrived. One without grand temples or sprawling empires, yet deeply expressive, artistic, and curiously literate. For carved into its pottery, figurines, and clay tablets are marks that suggest a written language, or something like it. These are the enigmatic signs of the Vinca symbols. In the fertile plains of the Danube River basin, stretching across parts of modern-day Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Bosnia, an ancient culture blossomed. It was peaceful, sedentary, and advanced far beyond what most people imagine for the Neolithic era. The Vinca culture, named after a site near Belgrade, flourished between 5,700 and 4,500 BCE. Thousands of years before the pyramids, before Sumer, before what we often call civilization. And yet, what they left behind forces us to rethink our definitions of early complexity. Among their ceramics and figurines, gracefully formed, often stylized with large eyes, narrow waists, and long limbs, archaeologists began to notice something else. Tiny symbols, sometimes incised, sometimes painted, always deliberate. There are hundreds of these symbols across the Vinca archaeological sites: crosses, zigzags, triangles, comb-like patterns, a shape like an M, a square bisected by a line, a series of parallel strokes. Many of these symbols recur, not randomly, but in repeating sequences, suggesting something more than decoration. Could these be the earliest writing system in human history? Some researchers believe so. If true, they would predate Sumerian cuneiform by at least 1,000 years. They would represent an indigenous European attempt to encode language, an intellectual leap made not by conquering kingdoms, but by settled agriculturalists who lived in harmony with the land. Others urge caution. They suggest the Vinca signs are proto-writing, a symbolic system used for counting, marking ownership, or conveying spiritual meaning, but not yet capable of representing full language. A kind of mental scaffolding, preparing the way for written expression, but not quite reaching it. Still, others argue the signs may be entirely symbolic or ritualistic, that they were never meant to be read in a linguistic sense, but instead used in ceremonies, to mark graves, or to denote clan identity. A form of communication that resided more in the realm of belief than in phonetics or grammar. But the debate remains open. There are no long texts, no bilingual inscriptions, no deciphered phrases, just short clusters of symbols found on clay figurines, ceramic vessels, spindle whorls, and tablets, sometimes arranged in rows, sometimes alone. One particularly haunting artifact is the so-called Tartaria tablets, discovered in Romania in 1961. 3 small clay tablets bearing Vinca-style symbols, one of them covered in signs arranged in horizontal rows. Some scholars view these as the clearest example of writing from the Vinca world. Others remain skeptical, uncertain of their function, age, or relation to later scripts. What is clear is that the Vinca people were not isolated. Their settlements were large, some housing thousands. They traded across regions, mined copper, made complex pottery, and maintained sophisticated social structures. This was not a society of scattered farmers. It was an enduring, organized culture that thrived for over a millennium. So why, if the symbols were a form of writing, did they not survive? Why did they disappear? By around 4500 BCE, the Vinca culture began to decline. Climate shifts, migration, changing trade patterns, these likely played a role. But as the people dispersed or evolved into other cultural identities, the symbols they left behind faded as well. No other culture in the region continued to use them. The signs, once pressed into wet clay with steady hands, were no longer part of the human story. Or were they? Some have drawn visual parallels between the Vinca symbols and later scripts, the Linear A of Crete, the Indus script of South Asia, even early Anatolian hieroglyphs. Could there have been a deeper connection, a common symbolic language that once stretched across early civilizations? There's no evidence to support this idea, yet the resemblance of certain shapes, simple strokes, crosses, chevrons, continues to provoke curiosity. Are these coincidences of design, or echoes of a forgotten shared system? More speculative theories abound. Some claim the Vinca symbols are remnants of a lost prehistoric civilization, one that spread knowledge across continents before being wiped out in a great flood or natural catastrophe. Others see them as expressions of shamanic visions, encoded rituals, or even messages left by non-human intelligence. Such theories remain outside the mainstream, but they speak to the enduring power of the unknown. These signs touch something ancient in us, a longing to know what came before memory. For now, the Vinca symbols remain undeciphered, not because no one has tried, but because they may lie on the edge of what can be deciphered. They sit at the boundary between symbol and speech, between meaning and mystery. Were they numbers, names, sacred words, or just patterns of significance known only to the people who made them? Perhaps the Vinca people did invent writing. Perhaps they almost did. Or perhaps their symbols held meaning in a different dimension altogether, one we no longer understand. Today, their artifacts rest in museum drawers or lie half-buried in the soil of the Balkans, their signs still visible, still waiting. What knowledge once flowed through those carved lines? What voices whispered through the patterns? And what else, buried deep beneath layers of time and earth, might one day be found? From the ancient symbols of the Vinca culture, scratched onto clay and echoed across millennia, we now move west to a quiet hillside in the heart of rural France. Here, in a small village tucked between forests and streams, an accidental discovery sparked one of the most controversial archaeological debates of the 20th century. A discovery that revealed strange artifacts, mysterious symbols, and more questions than answers. These are the Glozelle tablets. In the Auvergne region of central France, not far from the town of Vichy, lies the unassuming village of Glozelle. Rolling fields, quiet farms, and old stone houses mark the landscape. Places where history runs deep, but rarely makes itself known. That changed in March of 1924. A young farmer named Émile Fradin and his grandfather were digging in their field when they struck what appeared to be a chamber buried beneath the earth. Inside were bones, ceramics, stone tools, and something stranger. Tablets of clay, inscribed with odd markings. Some bore lines and geometric shapes. Others seemed to form symbols, like letters from a language no one had ever seen. Archaeologists soon descended on the site. More tablets were found. Hundreds. Alongside them were strange figurines, polished stones, and engraved antlers. The tablets were the most puzzling, many of them marked with rows of symbols, resembling alphabets, but unlike any known script from ancient Europe. The markings had the look of intention, repeated characters, horizontal lines of writing. Some bore resemblance to Phoenician letters, others looked vaguely like runes. A few mimicked shapes found in early Mediterranean scripts, but no one could say for sure what they were, or how old they might be. Initial excitement was quickly followed by skepticism. The site lacked clear stratigraphy. Artifacts seemed jumbled across time periods. Neolithic tools mixed with Iron Age pottery, and what some believed were medieval remains. Could it be a forgery, a hoax, or worse, a modern fabrication meant to deceive? The French archaeological community became divided. Some supported the authenticity of the tablets, arguing they represented a forgotten chapter of early European writing. Others dismissed the entire find as fraudulent, an elaborate ruse created by amateurs or opportunists. The controversy soon spiraled. Accusations were made, legal cases filed. Freyden himself, only a teenager when he found the site, was accused of forgery, though never convicted. Defenders of the Glazel site pointed to the volume and consistency of the inscriptions. Over 3,000 objects were recovered from the area over the decades that followed. Too many, they argued, to be the product of a single person's imagination. Some of the symbols, especially those on the clay tablets, repeat with such precision that they suggest a structured script, an alphabet, a syllabary, or a form of proto-writing. No definitive translation has ever been offered. The Glazel symbols remain undeciphered. The mystery deepened when radiocarbon testing was eventually applied to some of the materials. The results, rather than clarifying the issue, added to the confusion. Some artifacts dated to the Iron Age, others to the Middle Ages, still others to around 300 BCE. The range of dates led some to conclude that Glazel may have been a site used and reused over centuries, or that the objects themselves had been placed together in a ritualistic or symbolic fashion. To this day, mainstream academia remains cautious. Glazel is rarely mentioned in textbooks. Its artifacts are often categorized as anomalies, its tablets left unread and largely unstudied. Yet the symbols persist. Their shapes are distinctive. Many are simple lines and angles. Some resemble familiar characters from early alphabets. A few are entirely unique. They are arranged in horizontal rows, sometimes with spacing, sometimes compacted, suggesting words, syntax, intention. And they're not isolated. Similar markings, though debated, have appeared on a handful of artifacts found elsewhere in France, and even as far as Spain and Italy. Could there have been a local tradition of writing or symbolic communication that has gone unnoticed? One that never developed into a full written language, but left traces in the soil of prehistoric Europe? Speculation, as always, has stepped in to fill the gaps. Some have suggested the Glazel tablets represent a long-lost writing system, perhaps a ritual language used by a priestly class or a regional dialect preserved only in symbolic form. Others believe they may be magical or mnemonic, used to remember songs, stories, or incantations passed down orally. More fringe theories have gone further, connecting the Glazel symbols to Atlantis, extraterrestrials, or a pre-Ice Age civilization erased by cataclysm. These ideas remain on the margins, yet they reflect a larger truth. Glazel does not fit neatly into any known category. It is a riddle with too many variables, too many missing pieces. Why would someone forge so many inscriptions with so much internal consistency? And if they were real, Why has the script not been found elsewhere in recognizable form? Was Glozell truly a local center of forgotten literacy, or simply a curiosity born of confusion? The site itself still exists. Friden went on to open a small museum in the village, displaying many of the artifacts he helped uncover. There, the tablets sit behind glass, silent, strange, and still unsolved. What if Glozell was real? What if it holds evidence of a culture we've overlooked? One that valued signs and symbols as more than art or ritual? What knowledge, what memory, might be locked within those faded marks on clay? The tablets do not speak, but they wait. From the contested soil of Glozell, where carved tablets blur the line between fraud and forgotten script, we now drift across the vast Pacific, toward one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. A volcanic island marked by towering stone figures, its winds carrying whispers of a lost civilization. Among the island's few surviving relics are wooden tablets, etched with glyphs so intricate, so deliberate, that many believe they once held the wisdom of an entire culture. And yet, no one can read them. These are the Rongorongo chant boards of Easter Island. In the heart of the South Pacific, more than 2,000 miles from the nearest continental landmass, rises a solitary triangle of land, known to its people as Rapa Nui. To the rest of the world, it is Easter Island, a name given by Dutch explorers who arrived on the island in 1722. Its windswept landscape is famous for the Mawai, those solemn stone giants that gaze inward from the coasts, their backs turned to the sea. But the real mystery of Rapa Nui may not lie in its statues, but in its writing. Scattered across a handful of surviving objects, wooden tablets, staffs, and ceremonial artifacts, are lines of carved symbols, stylized and rhythmic, like a silent chant frozen in form. These inscriptions make up what is now known as Rongorongo, a script found nowhere else in the Pacific, and one that has defied all attempts at decipherment. The term Rongorongo means to recite or to chant out in the Rapa Nui language, a clue that these carvings may have once served an oral tradition, perhaps recited in rituals, ceremonies, or acts of remembrance. The most striking examples are what scholars refer to as chant boards, flat wooden panels covered in flowing glyphs, arranged in rows, carved with tools of bone or shark tooth. The boards are read in a unique pattern known as reverse boustrophodon. The text begins at the bottom left, moves to the right, then the tablet is flipped upside down for the next row, and the pattern continues. This alternating movement, like the turning of a plow across a field, is found in only a handful of ancient scripts, and suggests an intentional, sophisticated writing tradition. But today, no one alive can read Rongorongo. When European missionaries arrived in the 19th century, they attempted to understand the script, but by then, its meaning had already begun to fade. The island's population had been decimated by slave raids, disease, and cultural upheaval. Elders who once may have known how to interpret the glyphs were gone. The chant boards, once sacred or ceremonial, were collected, burned, or repurposed. The oral knowledge, passed for generations, was lost. Just over 24 authentic Rongorongo inscriptions survive today, many held in museums in Europe and the Americas. Each is a tantalizing fragment of a script that may have encoded the island's myths, genealogies, rituals, or something else entirely. The glyphs themselves are striking. There are over 120 basic signs, many of them depicting human figures, birds, fish, plants, geometric forms, and abstract shapes. Often, the figures are shown in profile, with curved limbs and elongated torsos. Some glyphs are repeated in patterns, others appear only once. Are these syllables, logograms, mnemonic devices, attempts at full written language, or something closer to an artistic representation of sacred sound. Scholars are divided. Some researchers argue that rongo-rongo is a form of true writing, a script capable of representing speech. Others believe it may be a proto-writing system, used to record ritual cycles, lineage, or cosmological concepts in ways that support memory, but do not directly transcribe spoken language. A kind of visual chant tethered to voice and ceremony. The problem lies in context. With no bilingual inscriptions, no audio recordings, and no consensus on the Rapa Nui language of the 18th century, there are no anchors for interpretation. We do not know what the chants said, nor how they were structured. Attempts to compare rongo-rongo glyphs to Polynesian languages have produced only limited success. More speculative ideas have emerged as well. Some suggest the script was a sacred system, known only to priests or elite scribes, its function deliberately hidden from the common people. Others propose it was used in rituals tied to the Birdman cult, or the seasonal transitions marked by solstices and lunar phases, many of which were embedded in Rapa Nui cosmology. One theory posits that rongo-rongo was not linguistic at all, but cosmographic, a map of celestial patterns, a calendar encoded in iconography, used to track agricultural seasons or ceremonial timing. There are hints in the placement of glyphs that support this idea. Repeated lunar shapes, rhythmic progressions, symbolic sequences that seem to mirror natural cycles. Then, there are the more speculative views that rongo-rongo may have been influenced by, or even descended from, Old World writing systems, carried by lost explorers, or arising independently through extraordinary cultural innovation. But such claims remain unverified and often contested. The mystery deepens when one considers that no other Polynesian culture developed writing. Oral traditions flourished, but written systems were unknown across the Pacific. That rongo-rongo may have emerged independently on this isolated island, thousands of miles from any other civilization with writing, challenges our assumptions about how and where literacy evolves. Was this a rare instance of writing born in isolation, or was it inspired by contact, perhaps brief, unrecorded, and now erased from memory? And why, if it was once known, did it vanish so quickly? Could the collapse of the culture, compounded by colonial pressures, have extinguished the last carriers of this knowledge in just a generation? The chant boards remain silent. They rest now behind glass, in climate-controlled vaults, in Berlin, in Santiago, in Washington, D.C., far from the windswept hills of their origin. Scholars scan and re-scan them, counting glyphs, tracing patterns, searching for a key. But the key, if it ever existed, may be lost. Still, the boards endure. Each line, each curve, carved with care, with memory, with meaning. What songs did these boards once carry? What names? What stories? What histories? We may never know. But perhaps, buried deep in the language of symbols and the rhythm of chants, rongo-rongo still remembers. From the curved glyphs of rongo-rongo, carved into driftwood and veiled in chant, we now drift back through time, farther than many written records reach, past dynasties, past empires, to the very threshold of memory. In a quiet valley in central China, archaeologists uncovered a Neolithic settlement that rewrote our understanding of early civilization. And among its artifacts were markings, simple yet deliberate, etched into bone, into pottery, into ancient silence. These are the Jiahu symbols. In Henan Province, in the middle reaches of the Yellow River Basin, lies a site that, for thousands of years, remained untouched beneath layers of soil and time. When archaeologists first began excavating Jiahu in the 1980s, they expected to find a typical Neolithic settlement, modest dwellings, rudimentary tools, perhaps early signs of agriculture. What they uncovered was something far more remarkable. The Jiahu site, dated to around 6,600 to 6,200 BCE, revealed evidence of early rice cultivation, domesticated pigs, and elaborate burial practices, clay kilns, stone tools, and most famously, the world's oldest playable musical instruments, flutes carved from the wing bones of cranes, tuned to what some believe is a pentatonic scale still used in Chinese music today. But then came something even more intriguing. On fragments of tortoise shells and bones, used in ritual practices or perhaps as tools, were incised markings. Small, repetitive, carefully placed. These were not random scratches. They bore signs of intention. And with that discovery, a new question emerged. Were these the earliest known symbols of writing? Over 24 of these markings have been catalogued. Some appear only once, others recur. A few resemble characters that would later appear in oracle bone script, the first fully developed writing system in ancient China, used nearly 4,000 years later during the Shang dynasty. Could there be a connection? The resemblance is tantalizing. A cross shape here, a square with inner strokes there. Parallels have been drawn between Jiahu symbols and later Chinese characters representing the sun, eye, or door. But the gap between them, both in time and in complexity, is vast. Mainstream scholars are cautious. Most believe the Jiahu symbols do not represent a full writing system. There's no evidence of grammar, syntax, or even consistent sequencing. The markings are too few, too limited in context. They may have been proto-writing, used for symbolic, ritual, or mnemonic purposes, rather than to record language directly. Others suggest they were ownership marks, used to identify the creator or owner of an object, or possibly ritual symbols tied to religious practices or cosmological beliefs. Their presence on tortoise shells, which would later become central in Chinese divination practices, suggests a spiritual significance that may have survived across millennia. But some researchers argue we may be underestimating them, that we expect too much from early writing, that even these sparse signs, repeated and intentional, represent a first step in the long path toward literacy. A moment when thought reached beyond voice and into form. A flicker of the human desire to preserve meaning, not just through speech, but through symbol. And if so, the Jiahu symbols may not be isolated. Similar Neolithic markings have been found at other sites in the region, particularly within the broader Palagang culture, to which Jiahu is loosely related. These include strokes on pottery, bones, and tools, sometimes linear, sometimes abstract, but always placed with apparent care. Are these the scattered remnants of a long-forgotten system of signs? Were they localized traditions, or echoes of a shared symbolic language stretching across ancient China? The question becomes even more complex when viewed alongside the broader puzzle of writing's origin. Did writing emerge independently in different regions? Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China? Or was there unseen cultural exchange between early societies? Could the markings at Jiahu represent one of the world's earliest experiments in recording thought? More speculative theories abound. Some have proposed that the symbols were not mere precursors to Chinese script, but the remnants of an entirely separate symbolic system, one lost to history. Others suggest that Jiahu may have been a center of ritual innovation, and that the signs we see are not the beginning of writing, but the vestiges of ritual codes used to access a spiritual or cosmological framework no longer understood. Some even point to the remarkable continuity of certain shapes, arguing that the Chinese script may preserve a hidden lineage, stretching not just to Shang oracle bones, but all the way back to Jiahu and beyond. And then there's the haunting simplicity of the symbols themselves. A grid of lines, a square with a center, a repeating stroke. To modern eyes, they appear minimal, even primitive. But what might they have meant to the people who carved them? Were they part of a spoken word, a number, a name, a prayer? The Jiahu people left no written records, only these small etchings, left in bone, hidden in earth, and now displayed behind glass in museum cases. But they whisper of something more. Not just a community of farmers and musicians, but a people reaching toward permanence, toward continuity beyond the moment. And maybe that's what writing is, at its core. A refusal to let time erase meaning. The Jiahu symbols remain undeciphered, but their presence is undeniable. What else might lie beneath the earth, waiting to be uncovered? What other forgotten scripts might remind us that even in the Neolithic dawn, humans were already trying to write themselves into the world? From the quiet echoes of Jiahu, where Neolithic minds scratched meaning into bone and shell, we step forward in time, but not out of mystery. We remain in the realm of ancient scripts, among the earliest known efforts to capture thought in lasting form. But now, we turn our attention to a place where civilization rose in tandem with Sumer and Akkad, where temples once stood along the rivers of southwestern Iran, and where another script, graceful and sharp, has kept its secrets for over 4 millennia. This is the enigma of Linear Elamite. In the vast sweep of the Iranian plateau, where desert plains give way to rugged hills, the ancient land of Elam once flourished. Nestled near the modern city of Susa, this early civilization was a rival and neighbor to Mesopotamia. Sometimes its enemy, sometimes its imitator. And while much of Elam's history has been told through the cuneiform of others, the Elamites left behind their own voice, pressed into stone in a script we still struggle to hear. Linear Elamite. Its characters are bold, clean, and geometric, composed of lines and wedges, arranged in neat columns or rows. They were typically carved into stone stelae and ceremonial inscriptions, often accompanying royal dedications or temple offerings. To the untrained eye, it might resemble early cuneiform, but it is a completely different system. No stylus was pressed into soft clay. This was writing cut into permanence. And yet, we cannot fully read it. Linear Elamite emerged around 2200 BCE, during the so-called Awan and Sukalma periods of Elamite history. It coexisted, briefly, with both cuneiform and an earlier undeciphered script, known as Proto-Elamite. Some scholars believe Linear Elamite evolved directly from that earlier form. Others suggest it was a separate experiment in literacy, an attempt to cast the Elamite tongue into a script that was their own, distinct from the wedge-shaped characters of Sumer. Roughly 20 known inscriptions in Linear Elamite have survived. Most come from monumental contexts, votive plaques, stone vessels, royal dedications. They were discovered in sites such as Susa, Anshan, and the temple complex of Jiroft, carved by or for kings, their names recorded in stone, though their words remain veiled. For decades, Linear Elamite was one of the great unsolved writing systems of the ancient world. But then, in the early 21st century, something began to shift. A series of new discoveries, particularly in Jiroft, uncovered longer inscriptions, more complete examples of the script. Researchers began to notice patterns, some signs repeated in ways that suggested grammatical structure. And crucially, in several cases, these inscriptions were found alongside texts written in Akkadian cuneiform, often mentioning the same names or events. For the first time, scholars had context, a framework, anchors of meaning. In 2022, a team led by French archaeologist François Decipher published a breakthrough proposal, a partial decipherment of Linear Elamite. Using bilingual inscriptions and statistical analysis, they proposed phonetic values for several symbols, claiming to identify names of Elamite rulers and religious phrases. It was a significant moment, but it also raised new questions. If this decipherment is correct, It would mark the first major step toward reading a lost voice from over 4,000 years ago. But not all scholars agree. Some caution that the decipherment remains tentative, based on a small and highly specialized corpus. Others argue that assigning phonetic values to signs without a broader body of texts risks circular reasoning. Still, something has changed. What was once a wall of unreadable symbols now has cracks, openings through which language might one day flow again. But beyond the progress lies the mystery that lingers. Why did the Elamites develop linear Elamite in the first place when cuneiform was already in use across the region? Was it an assertion of cultural independence, a sacred script used only in religious or royal contexts, or was it a practical innovation that simply failed to spread? And perhaps more intriguingly, why did it disappear so quickly? By 1900 BCE, linear Elamite fades from the record. The Elamites returned to using Mesopotamian cuneiform to write their own language, adapting foreign symbols to suit local speech. The native script, an effort to carve a unique identity in stone, was abandoned, forgotten. Its characters left unspoken for millennia. Some believe the script was never widely adopted, reserved for a narrow class of scribes or elite ritual use. Others suggest that political shifts, invasions, or religious reforms may have extinguished its use entirely. A fragile script in a turbulent world. What then was written on those stelae? Were they dedications to gods long forgotten? Royal boasts of victory and legacy? Did they contain myths, laws, or messages to the divine, etched not for the eyes of men, but for celestial ears? Each inscription is a frozen moment in a language on the brink of silence. And even now, as scholars work to tease meaning from symbol, the larger questions persist. What does it mean to lose a script? What does it say about a culture whose voice is known only through others? And how many more such scripts, buried in deserts, sealed in tombs, hidden in plain sight, have yet to speak? Linear Elamite may yet reveal its truths, or it may remain, like so many other ancient codes, an enduring riddle. But its characters endure, stubborn lines across millennia, insisting that someone, once, had something to say. From the clean, incised lines of linear Elamite, etched in stone and half recovered through painstaking decipherment, we move northward into the wooded folds of the Balkan Mountains. Here, in the cool shadow of limestone cliffs, beneath the ancient canopy of fir and beech, lies a carving few have heard of, and fewer still have understood. It is hidden, weathered, and silent. A message, perhaps, from a forgotten people. This is the mystery of the Citovo inscription. High in the Rhodope Mountains of southern Bulgaria, where rugged terrain meets the mists of old folktales, sits a narrow gorge near the village of Citovo. It is a remote and wild place, thick with pines and dense undergrowth, where time seems to stand still. Along a cliff face, just above a shallow cave once used for shelter, something strange is carved into the rock. A line of symbols, meticulously cut into the stone, stretches nearly 3 meters in length. Angular shapes, repeating forms, rhythmic spacing. These marks are not the scrawls of idle hands. They are precise, measured, intentional. This is the Citovo inscription, a text carved into living rock, whose meaning remains a mystery. The inscription was first brought to public attention in 1928 when a group of hikers stumbled upon it and notified authorities. Among them was a Bulgarian army officer named Alexander Piv, a linguist and historian who believed the carving might be the remnant of an ancient and unknown alphabet. Fascinated, he documented the inscription and began to circulate rubbings and photographs among fellow scholars. But Piv's interest came at a price. In the politically tense atmosphere of the 1930s, Bulgaria, his correspondence about the Citovo text, written in German, was misinterpreted as coded espionage. He was arrested, interrogated, and executed under suspicion of being a spy. The Citovo inscription faded into obscurity for decades, buried not only by moss and weather, but by history itself. Today, the inscription remains in situ, cut into the soft limestone of the cliff face, weathered by wind and rain, yet still readable. It is composed of around 40 glyphs, each roughly 15 to 25 centimeters in height. Some resemble stylized letters. Others suggest pictograms or geometric forms. The spacing between them is remarkably consistent, hinting at linguistic structure. But what language do they belong to? And who carved them, here, in the shadow of the mountain? Some scholars have suggested the inscription dates to the Thracian period, roughly the 1st millennium BCE. The Thracians, an Indo-European people who inhabited much of what is now Bulgaria, left behind few written records. Most of what we know about them comes from Greek historians and scattered archaeological finds. If the Citovo text is Thracian, it could represent one of the only known native inscriptions from this enigmatic culture. But the script does not match any known Greek, Latin, or early Balkan alphabets. Its angular, sometimes symmetrical characters appear unrelated to other ancient European scripts. Others propose that the inscription may be far older, perhaps Neolithic in origin, linked to the Vinca symbols found throughout the Danube basin. These signs, carved into pottery and figurines more than 7,000 years ago, also remain undeciphered. Could the Citovo marks be a monumental expression of that same symbolic system? Still more researchers see visual parallels between the Citovo glyphs and the runic alphabets of Northern Europe, particularly the Elder Futhark. Yet the distance in time and geography makes such a link tenuous. The Rhodope region is not known for runic influence, and no other comparable inscriptions have been found nearby. Then, there are the speculative theories. Some believe the inscription may be the remnant of a lost civilization, one that predated recorded history and left behind only fragmentary traces. Others claim the text could encode astronomical knowledge or calendar systems, carved into stone to align with seasonal events or sacred rites. And still others suggest a ritual purpose. Perhaps the inscription was meant to invoke or protect, rather than communicate in the modern sense. The location itself, above a cave hidden in the forest, suggests it was never meant for mass viewing. It was placed for those who knew where to look, for those who already understood. What little context we have comes from the landscape itself. The Rhodope Mountains are steeped in legend. In ancient times, they were said to be home to Orpheus, the mythic musician who could charm all living things with his song. The region is rich in prehistoric tombs, dolmens, sanctuaries, and rock altars. It was a sacred landscape, where stone and symbol often met. Could the Citovo inscription be part of that sacred geography? A prayer carved in rock, a contract between people and gods. Despite modern technology, no one has been able to translate the glyphs. There is no known parallel script, no accompanying artifacts, no second example. Linguists have scanned the characters, run them through databases of ancient alphabets, looked for patterns. Yet, no meaning has emerged. The Citovo inscription remains a one-of-a-kind artifact, a single line of language, frozen in stone, without a known author or context. A message from someone to someone, or perhaps from no one at all. What was carved here, in the quiet forest, centuries or millennia ago? Was it the declaration of a tribe, the creed of a vanished people, a warning, a myth, or something more abstract? An early experiment in the visual representation of thought. And what else, hidden in the forests and cliffs of the Balkans, might one day bring clarity? The Citovo inscription asks us to look closer, to listen, to wonder. It is a voice on the edge of silence, waiting, still, to be heard. From the shaded cliffs of Bulgaria, where the Sitovo inscription continues to whisper its undeciphered message, we now cross oceans and continents to reach the high plains of South America. Here, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, where Andean skies stretch endlessly above and pre-Incan ruins dot the rugged terrain, a single artifact rests at the center of an archaeological enigma. A ceramic vessel unlike any other, covered not only in imagery, but in writing. Writing that, to this day, should not exist where it was found. This is the mystery of the Fuente Magna Bowl. Just outside the Bolivian city of La Paz, on the fertile outskirts of a site called Fuente Magna, a curious object was unearthed in the 1950s. The discovery was reportedly made by a local farmer who stumbled upon a broken ceramic vessel buried in the earth. At first glance, the bowl seemed like a typical piece of Andean pottery, weathered, substantial, ceremonial in appearance. But a closer look revealed something far more extraordinary. Inside the bowl, along the inner rim and base, were inscribed symbols, rows of linear markings deliberately carved into the clay. To the eye trained in Andean archaeology, these glyphs appeared foreign, not Incan, not Tiwanaku, not any known native writing of South America. Instead, some researchers claimed the inscriptions resembled Sumerian cuneiform, a script native to ancient Mesopotamia, on the other side of the world. This sparked immediate controversy. Could a bowl in Bolivia genuinely bear writing from a civilization that flourished in the Fertile Crescent over 5,000 years ago? And if so, how did it get there? The questions unsettled conventional timelines. The answers were nowhere to be found. The bowl, often referred to as the Fuente Magna Bowl, was eventually brought to the attention of archaeologists and epigraphers. Photographs and rubbings circulated among specialists. The outer surface of the vessel was decorated with familiar Andean motifs, zoomorphic figures, abstract designs. But the interior markings remained an outlier. Several lines of symbols encircled the base and lower walls. Some were pictorial, resembling animals or stylized plants. Others appeared more abstract, composed of wedges, slashes, and angles. A few characters, to some eyes, bore striking similarity to the Sumerian or Proto-Sumerian script used in early Mesopotamian temple records. Could this be a case of transoceanic contact or a simple misidentification? Mainstream archaeology remains cautious. Most scholars do not accept the Fuente Magna Bowl as evidence of ancient writing in pre-Columbian South America, let alone one linked to Mesopotamia. The provenance of the artifact remains uncertain. No professional excavation documented its discovery. Its context in the ground, its surrounding materials, its dating, all are murky. And yet, the bowl is real. It exists. It can be held, examined, photographed. It has weight, texture, presence. In the 1990s and early 2000s, a number of researchers, most notably Bolivian archaeologist Bernardo Biados and epigrapher Clyde Winters, proposed that the script on the bowl was a variant of Proto-Sumerian, specifically linked to Libyco-Berber or early African writing systems. According to their interpretation, the bowl contains a religious dedication, perhaps to a goddess, suggesting the vessel was used in ritual ceremonies. These claims, however, have not been widely accepted in academic circles. Critics point to the lack of independent verification, the subjective nature of script comparison, and the potential for misinterpretation due to the stylized nature of the symbols. Without radiocarbon dating or stratigraphic context, it's difficult to determine whether the bowl is ancient or a more modern artifact, carved in imitation of ancient scripts. Some even suggest that the inscriptions could have been added later, post-discovery, perhaps to increase the artifact's perceived value or significance. And yet, the glyphs persist. So do the questions. If the bowl is authentic and ancient, then it would represent a profound anomaly, evidence of contact between civilizations across oceans long before Columbus or even the Polynesians. It would require a re-evaluation of trade, migration, and cultural diffusion in the ancient world. But if the bowl is a forgery or a misinterpretation, it still tells a story. A story of how deeply we long to connect the past across boundaries. How symbols, wherever they're found, invite us to imagine what might have been. How language, written or carved, deciphered or not, carries the power to unsettle our certainties. The Fuente Magna bowl currently resides in a museum in La Paz, Bolivia, where it continues to provoke debate, fascination, and doubt. Visitors stand before it, peering at the inscriptions that seem to speak in a language no one expects to hear in the Andes. Was it brought across the ocean by unknown sailors? Was it carved by a local artisan with distant inspiration? Or is it simply an artifact out of place, out of time, and out of explanation? No matter the answer, the bowl remains what it has always been. A silent witness to something we do not yet understand. A vessel, a text, a question. From the high plateaus of Bolivia and the enigmatic glyphs of the Fuente Magna bowl, we now cross the Atlantic to a land where stone speaks across deserts. Amid windswept dunes and rugged mountains, beneath scorching suns and ancient skies, another script emerges. It is carved into cliff faces, inscribed on tombs, and whispered across millennia. A writing system born from one of the world's oldest and most enduring cultures. Mysterious, fragmentary, alive even today in a new form. This is the puzzle of the Libico-Berber script, also known as ancient Tifinagh. In the vast sweep of North Africa, from the western edges of Egypt to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, thousands of rock carvings remain scattered across the land. On boulders, canyon walls, and isolated stelae, they tell a story in silent lines and dots, cryptic characters that stretch across time and geography, yet still resist full understanding. This is the legacy of the Libico-Berber script, a writing system used by the indigenous Amazigh, Berber peoples, long before the arrival of Arabic, Latin, or Greek. The characters are simple, geometric, and distinct. Triangles, circles, X-shapes, dots, vertical and horizontal strokes. They are arranged in rows, sometimes read left to right, sometimes right to left, and sometimes vertically. In some cases, the direction alternates within the same inscription, as if the script itself was fluid, shaped as much by the landscape as by grammar. Most inscriptions are short, names, titles, tribal identifiers. And yet, their presence across such a vast territory suggests more than mere labels. These symbols were not isolated marks. They were part of a tradition, a system of thought committed to stone. Archaeologists believe the earliest forms of this script date back to at least the 6th century BCE, though some suggest it may be far older, possibly emerging in the Bronze Age. It was used by ancient Numidians and Mauritanians, peoples who once ruled parts of present-day Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. And yet, despite being one of the oldest alphabets in continuous use, the Libico-Berber script has never been fully deciphered. Why? Because the written tradition was deeply oral in character. Unlike other ancient scripts, Libico-Berber inscriptions were not used to write literature, legal codes, or religious doctrine. They appear to have served memorial and territorial purposes, marking graves, dedicating monuments, delineating tribal lands. Most inscriptions are extremely brief, often limited to names. There is no equivalent of a Rosetta Stone. No bilingual text offering a linguistic bridge. And while some characters resemble letters found in later Tifinagh, still used today by the Tuareg people of the Sahara, many signs remain ambiguous in form and function. The modern Tifinagh alphabet, a direct descendant of the ancient script, is still in use among Berber communities in Mali, Niger, and southern Algeria. It has even been adapted into a standardized form for use in schools and signage in Morocco and other regions where Amazigh culture is being revived and preserved. But the ancient version, Libico-Berber proper, is a different story. While about 2/3 of its characters have been tentatively deciphered, many remain unreadable or uncertain. Some signs appear only once in the entire corpus of inscriptions, making their function difficult to determine. Others seem to have changed shape depending on region or time period, hinting at a flexible and evolving script. In some areas, the script was carved deeply and boldly, preserved well in dry climates. In others, it was etched lightly, now barely visible beneath centuries of wind erosion and sand. And then, there are the questions of meaning. Were these inscriptions purely utilitarian, marking land and legacy? Or were they part of a ritual tradition, imbued with symbolic or spiritual significance? Some researchers believe the signs may have carried dual meanings, both phonetic and ideographic. A letter and a symbol, a name and a concept. This possibility aligns with Amazigh oral tradition, where language is woven tightly with myth, poetry, and memory. Still others have suggested that some inscriptions may encode calendrical or astrological information. The recurring appearance of certain signs, stars, dots, spirals, has been interpreted as possible references to cosmic cycles or agricultural seasons. But without longer texts or contextual clues, such theories remain speculative. Fringe theories go even further. Some have drawn connections between Libico-Berber and Phoenician, or South Arabian scripts, suggesting early contact between North Africa and the Levant. Others propose links to ancient Egypt, or even to Atlantean legends, claims not supported by linguistic evidence, but fueled by the script's enduring mystery and geographical reach. And yet, what makes the Libico-Berber script so unique is not just its ancient past, but its living future. Unlike many undeciphered scripts, this one has descendants. Modern Tifinagh, used by the Tuareg and recognized in national scripts, keeps the shape and spirit of the old letters alive. In a sense, the language has never truly died. It has simply shifted, evolved, adapted. And still, something remains hidden. What did the earliest Libico-Berber inscriptions really say? What memories were carved into rock across the deserts and hills? And how many voices have been lost, not because they were silenced, but because they were never quite heard? New inscriptions are still being discovered in remote parts of the Maghreb and Sahara. Each new find offers a chance to understand more, to recover a little more of what was carved so long ago. Names, yes, but maybe also stories. A worldview written not in books, but in stone and sand. The Libico-Berber script is not just a riddle from the past. It is a language caught in transformation, a code on the edge of understanding. What more might it reveal if we learn how to read it, not only with the eye, but with the memory of those who once etched it by hand, across a vast and ancient land? From the stone-carved glyphs of the Libico-Berber script, etched into the bones of mountains across North Africa, we now move east into the arid hills of the Judean desert. Here, beneath layers of sand and time, a scroll was discovered unlike any other. Not written on parchment or papyrus, but on thin sheets of metal. Not a tale of prophets, nor a book of laws, but a list, cryptic, evocative, and never fully explained. A message preserved in copper. This is the mystery of the copper scroll. It was 1952 when archaeologists, working in Cave 3 near Qumran, not far from the Dead Sea, stumbled upon a peculiar object. Among fragments of ancient texts and pottery, hidden in a dark crevice, they found two rolled cylinders of greenish-brown metal, oxidized with age, fragile as old bark. At first, it wasn't even clear what they had found. Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, which were delicate manuscripts inked on animal skin or papyrus, this scroll was made of pure copper, alloyed with a small amount of tin. It was far too brittle to unroll without shattering. For years, it remained a sealed riddle. Eventually, in 1955, a team at the University of Manchester carefully cut the scroll into 23 narrow strips, like thin slivers of a shattered message. When the fragments were finally deciphered, what they revealed was something no one had expected. The Copper Scroll is not a religious text. It contains no hymns, no scripture, no prophecy. Instead, it reads like a treasure map, a list of 64 locations, each one detailing a buried hoard of gold, silver, or sacred vessels. Each entry names a place, a measurement, a weight. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, 42 talents lie beneath the steps. Or, in the cistern that is in the courtyard of the peristyle, 9 talents are hidden by 3 cubits of earth. Talents, cubits, chambers, stones. These are the words that repeat. Altogether, the scroll describes a staggering amount of treasure. Over 4,600 talents of gold and silver, by some estimates. Enough to fund an army, a kingdom, a nation. But where did it come from? And why was it recorded in such an unusual and enduring form? Unlike the other Dead Sea Scrolls, which are largely theological, the Copper Scroll appears wholly secular, logistical even. Scholars quickly began to ask, who wrote it? When? And where is all this treasure? The scroll is written in a variant of Mishnaic Hebrew, different from the biblical Hebrew found in most Qumran texts. Its style is terse, practical, and unembellished, more like an inventory ledger than a sacred record. The letters are chiseled rather than inked, possibly indicating that it was copied from an earlier parchment version onto metal for durability. Most scholars date the Copper Scroll to around 68 CE, during the final years of the Second Temple period, when Roman forces were descending upon Jerusalem, and the Jewish population was in revolt. Some believe the treasure it describes may have been hidden by priests or rebels, seeking to protect sacred wealth from Roman looting. But no treasure has ever been found. Despite numerous expeditions and searches across the Judean desert, none of the 64 listed caches has been definitively identified. The locations are often vague, referencing landmarks or features that may no longer exist, or that were deliberately obscured. Some are nestled in valleys, others beneath steps or within cisterns. But the geography remains uncertain, and the descriptions cryptic. Was the scroll a genuine inventory, or a symbolic document? Was it a record of treasure long since removed, or never hidden at all? Some researchers propose that the scroll is not literal, but allegorical, a kind of esoteric guide to spiritual or ritual wisdom. Others suggest it is real, but the treasure was already recovered centuries ago, perhaps by the Romans themselves or early sects who knew the locations. There is also a theory that the Copper Scroll may not have originated in Qumran at all. Its style, language, and material differ markedly from the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Was it brought there later, hidden in the cave as a last resort, or planted by those fleeing persecution? Then there are the more speculative ideas. Some believe the scroll references the treasure of the First Temple, hidden away during the Babylonian conquest centuries earlier. Others suggest it is tied to the mysterious temple treasures described in the Book of Maccabees, items sacred to ancient Judaism, including the menorah, the Ark of the Covenant, or ritual vessels of untold significance. And still, others have claimed connections to Freemasonry, Knights Templar, or lost knowledge carried into the desert by secretive sects, narratives that veer into legend more than history. But amid all this speculation, one fact remains: the Copper Scroll is real. It is not a forgery. It is not an embellishment. It exists, and its content, whether literal, symbolic, or something else, is unlike anything else found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why was it written in metal when parchment would have sufficed? Why such painstaking effort for a list? And why has no trace of its hidden wealth ever been uncovered? Perhaps the treasure was metaphorical. Perhaps it was already lost, destroyed, or spent. Or perhaps it still lies beneath the sands, waiting, just beyond the reach of modern understanding. What was the true purpose of the Copper Scroll? A map? A warning? A relic? Or something more? From the brittle sheets of the Copper Scroll, where treasure, faith, and secrecy were hammered into metal, we now shift east to the ancient crossroads of Central and South Asia. A place where languages converged, empires rose and fell, and scripts danced across stone, wood, and palm leaves in styles both fleeting and profound. Amid these fragments of ancient communication, there emerges a forgotten numerical system, brief, elusive, and only partially understood. This is the quiet mystery of the Kharosthi numerals. In the dust-colored ruins of ancient Gandhara, a region that once spanned parts of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan, echoes of a once-thriving civilization still linger. Here, where Hellenistic influence mingled with Buddhist devotion, where Persian roads met Indian philosophies, scribes once etched their thoughts in a fluid, right-to-left script, graceful, looping, and uniquely adapted to the needs of empire. This was Kharosthi, an ancient script derived from Aramaic, used between the 4th century BCE and the 3rd century CE. It was the script of merchants, monks, and kings. It carried Sanskrit and Prakrit inscriptions on rock edicts, trade documents, and relic dedications. Its letters are mostly deciphered, its grammar understood. But within Kharosthi lies a smaller, stranger puzzle. A set of symbols meant not for words, but for numbers. The Kharosthi numeral system. These numerical symbols appear only in a handful of inscriptions, often in financial or religious contexts. Small clusters of marks, barely noticeable beside the curves of the script they accompany. Yet they represent quantities, values, and calculations that once mattered greatly. The system is additive, much like Roman numerals. That is, symbols are combined to create values. A specific mark for 1, another for 10, another for 100. To write 23, a scribe might use 2 10 marks and 3 1 marks in succession. But unlike Roman numerals, the forms of Kharosthi numbers vary subtly across documents. There is no standardized form etched into stone, no chart with clear equivalences. The numerals shift in shape, region, and perhaps even in meaning. Which raises the question, do we fully understand these numbers at all? Unlike the letters of Kharosthi, which were preserved in dozens of inscriptions and manuscripts, the numerals appear infrequently, sometimes only once or twice in an entire scroll. They have been found on clay tablets, birchbark manuscripts, and relic jars. In some cases, scholars are not even certain which marks are numbers and which are ligatures, or scribal flourishes. There is no formal numeral 0. No positional notation like we see in the later Indian or Arabic systems. And yet, there is something hauntingly methodical about the way these marks were used, structured, measured, as if part of a logic now just out of reach. What's most fascinating is that Kharosthi was used at a time of intense numerical innovation in the Indian subcontinent, a region that would eventually give birth to the concept of 0 and the modern decimal system. Could Kharosthi numerals have played a role in that development? Were they an experimental system that prefigured later breakthroughs, or a parallel thread that vanished before it could evolve? Scholars have attempted to reconstruct the system based on inscriptions and patterns in surviving manuscripts. The work is meticulous, tentative, fragile. Certain symbols are confidently assigned values, while others remain ambiguous. Some appear to change value depending on context. A puzzle that suggests regional variation, or a missing interpretive key. Adding to the enigma is the fact that Kharosthi numerals were supplanted and forgotten. By the 4th century CE, the Kharosthi script itself began to fade, replaced by Brahmi and its derivatives, scripts that would eventually evolve into Devanagari, Bengali, Tibetan, and many others. Along with the script, the numeral system vanished too. It left no direct descendant, no legacy. It was absorbed into the sands of history, remembered only through a few surviving scratches in stone and ink. Why did it disappear? Was it too limited? Too localized? Did the rise of positional notation render additive systems obsolete? Or was the knowledge simply lost, discarded in favor of scripts and systems tied to rising political powers and shifting cultural centers? The absence of documentation is striking. No manuals, no glossaries, no teaching texts. The numerals survive only in use, not in theory. And yet, the mystery is not entirely closed. Recent discoveries in places like the Bamiyan Valley, Taxila, and Nia have revealed more documents bearing traces of these numerals. As digital tools and imaging techniques advance, once illegible manuscripts are being re-examined. Hidden ink emerges. Obscured marks become visible. Context becomes clearer. Will we one day reconstruct the full numerical system used by these ancient scribes? Or will Kharosthi numerals remain, like so many lost codes, just beyond reach? There is something poetic in the idea that a civilization could speak clearly, but count in silence, its numbers half remembered, half understood. That beneath the declarations of kings and the prayers of monks, a second language of quantity, value, and measurement slipped quietly away. Today, those same numbers rest in museum cases and climate-controlled archives. They sit quietly in margins and footnotes, beside words we can read. But next to values, we can only guess. What knowledge did these numbers once encode? What debts were recorded? What offerings weighed? What distances measured in a system now unreadable? In the grand story of ancient writing, Kharosthi numerals are a footnote. But perhaps they are something more. A fleeting glimpse into how ancient minds shaped the concept of value. A question mark carved into the history of mathematics. From the forgotten numerals of Kharosthi, marks left by merchants and monks along the Silk Road, we now turn to the humid shores of Southeast Asia, where sea winds carry the scent of rain and salt, where rivers flow into wide harbors, and tides bring with them not only trade, but mystery. Here, at the mouth of a great waterway, once stood a solitary stone, silent, weathered, and carved with words no one has ever fully understood. This is the enigma of the Singapore stone. At the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, where the Singapore River meets the sea, modern skyscrapers now pierce the clouds. But long before the glass towers and neon skyline, this place was a crossing point, a narrow strait that linked empires, traders, and pilgrims from across Asia. It was here, in the early 1800s, that British surveyors came upon a massive sandstone boulder, partially buried at the mouth of the river. Rising more than 3 meters high and several meters across, it stood at a place then called Rocky Point, near the entrance of the harbor. What caught their attention was not the size of the stone, but what was written upon it. Lines of ancient script, neatly carved across its weathered surface. Though time and tide had eroded much of the inscription, fragments remained clear. Rows of flowing characters, carefully spaced, deliberate. A text, a message, but one whose meaning was already lost. The stone came to be known as the Singapore Stone. In 1843, the British, eager to widen the harbor entrance, blew it up with dynamite, reducing the ancient boulder to rubble. Only a single large fragment, bearing about 50 legible characters, was salvaged and sent to the Raffles Museum. Today, that piece resides in the National Museum of Singapore. But the question remains, what did the inscription say? The script is carved in Old Indian Brahmi, or Kawi-derived characters, possibly dating as far back as the 10th to 14th century CE. Its style suggests connections to scripts used in Java, Sumatra, and other parts of maritime Southeast Asia, regions that once formed part of powerful empires like Srivijaya and Majapahit. Yet despite this regional familiarity, no one has successfully deciphered the text. The language it encodes remains unknown. Is it Old Javanese, Sanskrit, a local Malay dialect transcribed with Indian-influenced letters, or something entirely different? Perhaps a now-lost Creole language shaped by centuries of trade and migration. The fragment we have is too small to offer certainty. Several scholars have proposed interpretations. One theory links the stone to legendary figure Badang, a strong man of Malay folklore, said to have hurled a massive boulder across the Singapore River. Some claim the inscription might commemorate a local hero, a king, or a sacred event. Others believe it may have been a boundary marker, or even a royal edict meant to assert control over the harbor. But these are educated guesses. No translation has ever been agreed upon. The script remains an unsolved cipher. More speculative theories have emerged as well. Some suggest the inscription could be evidence of early Indianized kingdoms in the region, perhaps tied to Hindu-Buddhist centers of power, now lost beneath jungle and city alike. Others see in it the possible echoes of pre-Islamic Southeast Asian scripts, systems of writing used only briefly, and later erased by religious and cultural transformation. And some have ventured even further into speculation, proposing links to ancient Tamil traders, or even suggesting the script may contain an undiscovered maritime language, spoken only along the straits, and never written down anywhere else. But without more of the stone, or a second example, all theories remain suspended in uncertainty. What makes the Singapore stone so compelling is not just its indecipherability, but its loneliness. Most undeciphered scripts appear in collections, in tablets, scrolls, or carvings that repeat forms and allow patterns to emerge. The Singapore stone stands almost entirely alone. One inscription, one chance to glimpse a vanished voice. And that chance, through historical carelessness, was nearly obliterated. What might the full inscription have revealed if it had been preserved? A royal genealogy? A religious chant? A list of trade routes or ports? A warning to sailors? Or something even more unexpected? There's also the question of why the stone was placed where it was. The mouth of a river is a powerful symbolic location, where fresh water meets the sea, where movement begins and ends. Was the stone a welcome, a boundary, a prayer? Why use such a difficult medium, hard sandstone, painstakingly carved, unless the message was intended to endure? It did endure, for centuries, until modernity shattered it. But the fragment that remains continues to inspire. It sits behind glass in Singapore's National Museum, cleaned, studied, displayed, still silent. And yet, within those flowing characters, there is movement, suggestion, memory. What language was spoken on the banks of the Singapore River 1,000 years ago? Who stood before the stone, chisel in hand, committing meaning to mineral? And what else lies buried beneath the modern city, still waiting to speak? The Singapore stone is not just a mystery. It is a threshold, a sliver of knowledge caught between land and water, past and present, script and silence. From the scattered glyphs of the Singapore stone, etched into a solitary fragment of the ancient maritime world, we now journey far north to a land of mists and stone, to wind-swept hills and moss-covered standing stones, to the shadowed glens and cold rivers of ancient Scotland. Here, Carved into the flanks of weathered slabs and rough-hewn monoliths are symbols that speak without sound. Mysterious, geometric, and deeply haunting, they are the only surviving script of a vanished people. These are the enigmatic Pictish symbols. In the green and grey heart of northern and eastern Scotland, where sea spray lashes the cliffs and fog drapes the highlands, dozens of ancient stones still stand. Silent and steadfast, they seem at first like relics of pagan rites or medieval memorials. But look closer, and you'll see them marked, carved with a distinct set of symbols that appear nowhere else in the world. A crescent moon intersected by a V-shaped rod, a double disc, a mirror and comb, abstract shapes, animal figures, intricate key patterns, horses, birds, serpents, even fantastical beasts. Some symbols are geometric, precise, and eerily modern. Others evoke myth or heraldry. But all are unmistakably Pictish. Who were the Picts? Roman historians describe them as fierce warriors, painted people who resisted Roman expansion into what is now Scotland. By the 3rd century CE, they were a recognizable cultural group, occupying territory north of Hadrian's Wall. But beyond that, their history is elusive. They left no written language, no books, no scrolls, no royal chronicles. What they left, carved into stone, are symbols. And more than 250 stones bearing them have been discovered across Scotland, dating from approximately the 4th to 9th centuries CE. The symbols appear alone, in pairs, or in elaborate compositions. Some are chiseled into rough-standing stones, others on finely worked cross slabs and ringed monuments. Some lie in open fields, others near burial mounds or old Christian sites. Many are found near water, streams, fords, and coastal promontories. But the meanings of these symbols remain entirely unknown. For decades, scholars have debated their purpose. Were they a form of proto-writing, a heraldic code for clans and kinship groups, religious or spiritual signs, or something more abstract, cosmic, ritual, or mnemonic? The symbols appear too consistent, too deliberate, to be mere decoration. They follow compositional rules. Certain symbols often appear in pairs, like the crescent with the V-rod, or the double disc with the Z-rod. These pairings seem to follow patterns, suggesting grammar, syntax, or structured meaning. And yet, there is no known Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription, no surviving oral tradition that explains the signs. The Pictish language, whatever it was, has vanished without a trace. Some scholars have attempted statistical analysis, mapping the frequency and order of symbols across dozens of stones. Their findings hint at a system that may lie between writing and symbol, too structured to be purely emblematic, but not quite evolved into full linguistic expression. A kind of visual code that may have conveyed names, titles, or sacred concepts. One theory suggests the symbols were used to mark lineage and land, a visual signature of sorts. Others believe they had ritual or funerary significance, marking the boundary between the living and the dead. Some even propose that the symbols encoded spoken phrases, like early Chinese or Egyptian scripts. And yet, despite growing databases and digital modeling, no one has cracked the code. Then there are the more speculative ideas. Some propose that the Pictish symbols were remnants of a lost pre-Celtic writing system, passed down from ancient megalithic cultures. Others connect the symbols to astronomical charts, mapping solar and lunar events in a symbolic language. There are even fringe theories that claim the symbols are messages from ancient seafaring civilizations, or the last echoes of a vanished Hyperborean society. But such ideas, though evocative, remain unsupported by archaeology. Perhaps the real enigma lies not in what the symbols were, but in what happened to them. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the stones stop appearing. The Picts themselves seem to vanish, absorbed into the emerging Gaelic kingdom of Alba, precursor to modern Scotland. Their language disappeared, their traditions faded, their symbols ceased to be carved. Why? Was it a cultural collapse, religious conversion, political assimilation? Did Christianity, rising in the north during this same period, sweep away older traditions of visual literacy and replace them with Latin script and sacred texts? Or was the loss more gradual, a quiet forgetting, one generation at a time? Today, the stones still stand. They weather storms. They watch silently over pastures, graveyards, and forest paths. Visitors walk past them every day, often unaware that they are gazing upon a language we cannot read. A crescent, a comb, a serpent twined through rings. What did these mean to the hands that carved them? Were they names, tribes, stories? Were they meant for human eyes or divine ones? Did the Picts intend their message to last forever? Or did they know it would one day fall silent? The Pictish symbols remain among the most haunting linguistic mysteries of the ancient world. They are not random, they are not recent, and they are not yet understood. A code without a key, a voice without a tongue. A people remembered only through the marks they left on stone.